Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
"Hello, Emily," Jason grumbled, looking at the unkempt-looking girl standing in the hallway behind his wife. "You're always bringing strange people into our house. Give her a couple bucks and tell her to get out of here." The wife looked at Jason reproachfully, without a word. The girl suddenly reached out from behind Emily's back and clasped an old photograph in her hand. Jason's face changed as he looked at the photo, and he couldn't hold back his feelings. In the corners of the old photo, two happily smiling young faces were staring back at him. Jason immediately recognized himself as the young man in the photo and the carefree girl next to him, the ex-girlfriend he had once sneakily dumped when he found out she was pregnant. The dirty girl behind Emily's back was staring at him with piercing blue eyes, the eyes of the same unhappy girl he'd left alone and pregnant years ago. There was no doubt in his mind that this was his daughter. More than once afterward, Jason had made excuses for himself: youth, inexperience. But there was another reason why he had flatly rejected the possibility of recognizing the future child and taking responsibility for her appearance. Not long before, Jason had met another girl, Emily. Their acquaintance began with an accidental collision on the street. From surprise, the girl dropped her bag and there was a ringing sound of broken glass. Jason apologetically helped her to collect her things. He noticed that Emily was slender, well-dressed, and very pretty. Jason walked her home and they began to socialize, dating. Soon Jason was surprised to learn that Emily was the daughter of the director of the factory where he worked. Jason, who had grown up in a poor family of drunkards and lived in an orphanage from time to time, could not believe his happiness. Even as a child, he had given himself his word that he would never repeat the fate of his desperately poor parents, and he had forgotten about that decision. This is my chance, Jason thought, determined to change his life with the help of his new acquaintance. However, there remained an ex-girlfriend he saw no place for in his new life. The news of her pregnancy made Jason furious. How dare she interfere and take away his chance? Who was she anyway? And it's unclear if it's his child. In desperation, her ex-girlfriend sobbed, "I know why you're leaving me, because of Emily. I know who she is and I understand why you're courting her. But don't you really care what happens to me and the baby?" Jason was adamant. He sternly advised his ex to get an abortion and find a new boyfriend who was better suited for her than he was. He had no doubt that Emily was in love with him, and they would be married soon. Jason could already see himself in his new status, dreaming of an expensive car and a tightly stuffed wallet, glaring at the people around him with superiority. Realizing that Jason had made up his mind, his ex-girlfriend cursed him in a rage, promising that this evil would return to him and no girl would ever be able to bear him children again. Not even someone as cool as Emily. In response, Jason only laughed at her, saying dismissively, "Why, you're also a mental idiot. Did I dump you?" Right, he left, but the words she'd said never went away and sometimes bothered him, though he reassured himself that he couldn't have done otherwise. After the lavish wedding, the couple lived in the spacious apartment the bride's father had bought. Jason's business had really taken off. His wife's father, approving of her choice, immediately appreciated Jason's desire to succeed in life and assisted him in every possible way. Thanks to his father-in-law's connections and patronage, Jason started his own business, which successfully developed. Money appeared in the family. Jason bought a good car, made gifts to his wife, and did not forget himself. Emily adored her husband, felt over the seventh heaven of happiness, and really wanted children. 3 years passed, then 5. However, so ardently desired by her pregnancy did not come. The couple were healthy. Doctors found no reason for the lack of children in their family. Emily repeatedly offered to take a foster child from an orphanage. However, each time Jason was adamantly opposed. Such a child would be a living reminder of his own childhood, which he so always wanted to forget. He also remembered the curses his pregnant ex-girlfriend had hurled at him. As if he wanted to prove that her prediction was nonsense, he persisted in convincing his wife that they were still young and they would have children. But as the years passed, the couple came to terms with their childlessness, and Jason gradually forced himself not to think about those curses and his ex-girlfriend at all. And now it was as if the past had reappeared in front of him, as if it were real. Jason stared at him with the piercing blue eyes of his unexpectedly blue-eyed daughter, and he was silent, unable to find the words. "Jason, I know everything." Emily interrupted the long silence. This girl's name is Katie. She's your daughter. Would you like to meet her? I don't mind, she said firmly, seeing that Jason was not happy about the situation. She's going to live in our house now. Are you crazy? Jason raised his voice. Why did you believe her so easily? What makes you think she's my daughter? Because of some picture? That's bullshit. Jason, calm down. Emily pushed the frightened girl forward. Katie, come on in. We need to talk about this together. Emily took Katie and her husband under her arm and led them into the living room, seating them on the couch. She sat down in the chair opposite. A few days ago, I noticed a girl standing by the fence of our cottage, but today she dared to come up to me, explaining who she was. Emily showed me this picture. Her mom is gone now. She's dead. Emily sighed and fell silent. But when she saw that her husband could barely contain himself from contradicting her, she continued. Katie explained everything to me and how mean you were to her mother. And I can see from your reaction that it's all true. So you listen and don't argue. Don't you have any interest in what happened to the woman you're supposed to love? You forgot her, but she didn't forget you. She didn't get an abortion, gave birth to a daughter, and has been watching your life unnoticed all these years. She loved you no matter what. Or maybe she felt that someday everything she knew about your life might come in handy. A few years ago, my mom got sick, Katie said. There was no one to help. The only family left was her brother, who went to America back in the 90s. And then there was no more news of his life, but Mom fought the disease. The money ran out and she had to mortgage the apartment. And about 2 weeks ago, Mom got worse. Realizing she was dying, she decided to tell me everything about you and about leaving her. And about the curse too, giving me the only memory of you, this photo. Jason, that girl may be your only chance to make up for what you've done, Emily continued. Especially after her mother died. The apartment was repossessed and Katie was put in an orphanage. You know what that means, don't you? Think about it. You're out of your mind, Jason yelled, as if out of a daze. Emily thought she didn't recognize her husband at all. He's the spitting image of his mother. So I've choked your brains out. What are you talking to me now, Jason, in my ears like a hypnotist? Look at her eyes, she's a real witch. Who is she? Were you listening all the way through? He was interrupted by Emily's scream. The girl, not wanting to go to the orphanage, ran away and found us. She has been wandering the streets for days, sleeping on a bench in the park, shivering from the cold at night. She is hungry and scared. So I think we should keep her warm and fed. But Ashley has agreed to take a DNA test, and somehow I'm sure it'll show your paternity. I see, and you don't doubt it. She added ironically, thinking that there was probably a lot she didn't know about her husband. Tomorrow morning we'll go to the lab and take the test to clear up any doubts. Now, Ashley, you need to clean yourself up. I'll let you change and then we'll go to the kitchen together. You need to eat. It's dinner time. Jason, we're waiting for you in the kitchen. Dinner's ready. Everything's on the stove. I'm not hungry, Jason snapped, and left the room in extreme irritation, realizing that he'd lost this fight. But nothing, he muttered to himself as he left the living room. We'll see who's who. The daughter had been found, but the DNA test had clearly shown that Ashley was Jason's daughter. When he tried to argue with his wife again, it was as if he'd run into a concrete wall. Emily was adamant that if she ever heard anything against Ashley being in the house again, she would file for divorce. Understand, the girl was even willing to become a servant in our house, if only we would adopt her instead. She said to her husband, trying to appeal to his reason. Emily was just happy, because her dream of having a daughter had suddenly become a reality. She did not hesitate to file the adoption papers and insisted that Jason recognize himself as her father. Ashley turned out to be a good girl. She couldn't believe her happiness that her life was getting better and she had a new mom. Ashley helped Emily around the house and spent all her free time with her. Only Jason didn't share their happiness. The thought that Ashley would be a constant reminder of his meanness in their home until she came of age drove him crazy. Wait a minute, you bastard, he thought. You'll run away from here yourself. Just give it time. You'll see. Since Ashley's arrival at their house, the couple had almost stopped talking. Emily's attempts to defuse the situation and involve Jason in their daughter's upbringing hadn't worked. He withdrew into himself and increasingly resorted to the bottle. Ashley stayed away from her father under the approving glances of her wife, realizing that if she tried to get along with him, she'd see no good. Jason had never been a stickler for alcohol, hardly ever drinking until now. But once, on his way back from work, he stopped by a bar, sat down near the bar, ordered a cup of strong coffee, hoping that the calm atmosphere of the cozy bar would distract him from bad thoughts. The music was soft and pleasant. There weren't many customers, and Jason soon relaxed, completely immersed in his thoughts. He was upset about what he had found out his company had lost the lucrative tender he had been counting on. Suddenly a voice sounded just above his ear. "What, buddy, did your wife leave you or something?" Women are like that, aren't they? I myself got my brains blown out. Don't grieve, brother. Spit on them, that's all. Let's have a little bang with you, and then life will be more fun. Vadik, he shouted to the bartender. For me, as usual, and what's your name? He asked, puzzled, wondering if he knew Jason or not. Jason glanced in his direction and realized that his unexpected companion was already drunk. Tyler was squinting drunkenly. He introduced himself enthusiastically, wondering if he should send the guy right away. Jason decided a change of scenery wouldn't hurt him, though, so he introduced himself. Not half an hour later, he had a glass of cognac in front of him, and his new acquaintance was reaching over with his own glass, sitting on a neighboring chair and winking and proposing the first toast to the meeting. Jason didn't want to get drunk, but the cognac was unexpectedly good, and soon he sensed that his new acquaintance Tyler wasn't so drunk. The bar became more crowded. Musicians came up on the stage and live music began to play. Jason's mood lightened a little for the first time in days. Suddenly he found his cognac glass empty, and Tyler was already reaching for it with a new toast, and then another and another. Jason sat there, not recognizing himself and not understanding how he'd ever gotten himself into this situation. The unaccustomed dose of alcohol was clouding his brain. He could barely make sense of what was happening. Suddenly, a noisy group of people piled into the bar, and judging by how animated Tyler was, they were his good acquaintances. They surrounded the bar, all of them quite tipsy. What happened next, Jason remembered vaguely. He'd gone to a restaurant with this group, then another. In the morning, he found himself in some apartment, lying in the arms of a drunkenly sleeping beauty, with makeup smeared on her face. He lowered his feet off the bed and realized they were standing on someone's sweaty back. As he struggled to put his head down, he felt a bout of nausea, bright flashes spinning in his eyes. Beneath his feet, right on the floor beside the bed, lay Tyler, an acquaintance from yesterday. He was wheezing in his sleep, spreading the smell of booze around the room, and didn't even wake up when Jason put his feet on him. Jason looked around and saw several other people sleeping soundly in huddles around the room. Suddenly he went cold, searching his pockets for his cell phone. The expensive watch his wife had given him for their wedding anniversary had mysteriously disappeared from his hand, and Jason frantically searched for the phone to see what time it was. By the light streaming in from the window, it was far from early morning. There was the sound of street noise through the open window, the sound of automobile engines. Somewhere behind the wall, music was playing softly. What time is it? Jason thought feverishly. His head was treacherously dizzy. The room and the drunken people around him were shifting before his eyes, as if they were on the rocks of the sea. His cell phone was in his jacket pocket. Jason turned on the screen and clutched his head. The meeting with the partners scheduled for today was supposed to start 3 hours ago. There was no point in hurrying now. The partners who had stayed late for this meeting were probably on a plane on their way home by now. Jason couldn't believe that he'd caused the disruption of an important meeting that would affect the future of his company. His phone screen was blaring with missed calls and he was being searched. But could he hear the calls through the snoring of his drunken rage after last night's libations? Barely finding his car keys, he shakily made his way to the door and left the house. To his surprise, the car was still there. How could I have driven it yesterday, Jason thought, getting behind the wheel and starting the engine. The next moment it seemed to him that the theater of the absurd was continuing as in a bad dream. The engine of his expensive car, which had been running smoothly before, suddenly malfunctioned as if on cue. Jason sat behind the wheel, not understanding what was happening, trying to start the always perfectly running engine. Finally, the car moved, and he pulled out of the yard and onto the street. Jason decided to drive straight home, informing his secretary that he wouldn't be at work today. He rudely advised her to mind her own business in response to her question about what had happened to him. It was rush hour, and Jason fought sleep furiously, idling among the cars in the endless traffic jams. He didn't get home until lunchtime, leaving the car on the street. Jason entered the gate, and as he approached the house along the tiled walkway, he heard his daughter's voice, as if telling him something. And his wife's answering voice, the witch. It's all her fault, he thought angrily. Before she came, everything had been nice and peaceful, and now there was nothing but trouble. And this is just the beginning. Well, wait a minute, you little bastard. I'll give you a sweet life. You think you snuck into our house like a snake and now you're going to live a sweet life? Don't get your hopes up. But my ex-wife got to me, even though she's dead. As he entered the house, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Emily appeared in the hallway. "Where have you been?" she asked sternly, wrinkling her nose at the pungent odor of booze. "I've been calling you every hour at work. They searched you. Why didn't you answer? What happened? I thought you were in trouble, but apparently you were just having a good time somewhere," she remarked, looking at her husband in surprise and thinking again how poorly she knew him. Ashley peeked out of the kitchen, but hid immediately when she noticed her father's hard stare in her direction. Jason was filled with black anger when he saw his daughter. It wouldn't fully weathe her eyes. The alcohol only made it worse. "You mean, girl, come here right now. You shut up and stay out of this." Jason shoved Emily roughly away, and she fell to the floor, losing her balance. Jason stepped over her and moved into the kitchen, leading the struggling Ashley out into the hallway. The girl squirmed and trembled in fear, waiting for the worst to happen. "Mommy," she screamed, rushing to Emily, who was struggling to get up off the floor, out of Jason's grasp. Ashley rushed over to Emily, helping her up. "Daddy hit you?" "Yes?" the girl cried and hugged Emily. "Mommy." Jason was furious. "What kind of mom is she to you? She's nothing to you. And I'm nothing to you. Don't you dare call me that, you little brat, or I'm going to." Jason stopped talking. Emily got up off the floor. "Ashley, you called me mom." "I've wanted to hear that from someone for a long time," she said, hugging the girl. "Don't you dare yell at her." Emily looked at her husband in fury. "You'd better go and sleep it off. You look like you're on the rack. Come on, Ashley." Sobering up was taking its toll, and Jason felt as if the air had gone out of him, like an inflatable balloon bobbing up and down. He struggled to the couch in the living room, collapsed on it, and fell into a dead, drunken sleep. He slept the rest of the day and night until morning. Jason woke up at dawn. Everything that had happened seemed like a bad, absurd dream. It seemed as if he had suddenly and unexpectedly fallen into some other reality that was completely different from the normal life he had been used to living before. The girl, he suddenly remembered, is the root of all my troubles and misfortunes. Indeed, until she appeared in our house, everything was fine, quiet, and here are now running eyes looking for her. Apparently it shines just like my mother's, only on a different plane. Take it away, and everything will be as it was before. Jason thought, standing under the cold jets of the shower. Breakfast was waiting on the table. Emily's always been a good wife, Jason thought as he munched on warm pancakes with sour cream and hot black coffee. There was a reason I'd chosen her to be my wife. Then, angry again, Jason choked on his coffee. Now he couldn't eat in peace in his own house. It's all her fault, Emily standing up for her. If she said anything, she'd be against it. This whole thing needs to be dealt with immediately. Let's see who's running away from who. If the little witch goes away, Emily will be back to her old self. No, she won't. Suddenly Jason had a plan: accuse the girl of stealing, make a scene, call the police, and demand she leave. Otherwise, juvie. Satisfied with himself, Jason quickly packed up and drove to work. In the reception area, Amber was already in her usual seat, saying hello. "Good morning, Jason," she said in the official tone of a disciplined subordinate. However, Jason didn't escape her curious, slightly surprised look. He frowned. Trouble again. "Okay, go get it," he mumbled grudgingly to the secretary. "That's what you're sitting here for." Amber nodded, silently escorting her boss to the door of his office. He's weird, she thought. Missed such an important meeting yesterday, and today he looks like he's been out all night. Amber was a smart girl and a good secretary, so she never said too much less ask stupid questions. What did she call Valentinovich to herself? He had never acted like a bore before. He had never harassed her without using his superior position. And he'd always paid her salary on time. What else does a girl need? Amber sometimes ironized to herself. Although having an affair with a rich boss, isn't that the dream of many girls like her? Even if he was married, what did it matter? There was a moment when she somehow hinted at it, making eyes, put on a shorter skirt than usual, passed him a special gait, swaying hips. But Valentinovich didn't fall for it, Amber decided. The boss was either too busy working, or, except for his wife, he didn't see anyone else around. But the latter is unlikely, she thought then. After all these years together, I'd go crazy just thinking about it. The fact that the boss had a mistress on the side, Amber did not allow. She would have found out about it. She had a good eye, and he didn't look like a man who liked to go out, always working, always in his own thoughts. But there was something wrong with Valentinovich. Amber pondered at work, staring at the computer screen. Had he found a hottie on the side? Suddenly it hit her. Now you're getting it, beautiful. She was going to do it, she was going to do it. And in the end, someone else snuck in instead of you. She thought grudgingly. Valentinovich looked as if he'd had a good night out. Where he'd been, and with whom, the question. But in any case, it was obvious that the boss had had a lot of fun. What an idiot to have missed such a man in my neighborhood, Amber thought. Jason entered his office, walked past his desk, and went straight to the break room. A round mirror hung on the wall near the sink and faucet. He leaned his palms on the edge of the sink and stared at his face reflected in the mirror. Frustration contorted his features, and he wrinkled his nose. The after-effects of that drunken binge were still lingering. His face looked wrinkled and aged. There were creases around his mouth and bags under his eyes, as if he'd been drinking heavily. Okay, with that look, except for Amber, no one will see me tonight. The meeting's postponed, the partners are gone. Jason suddenly remembered the meetings he'd blown off. This was really bad. Or should I have Amber call them? No, I'd rather do it myself. Jason took another look at his reflection in the mirror. It wasn't any better. He didn't feel like working at all. I shouldn't be drinking like this, especially not in such quantities, and in such strong drinks, he thought, trying to tune into the upcoming conversation. There's a reason I haven't drunk all my life. No more. Alcoholic parents. My father drank endlessly, went out, didn't want to work, disappeared for weeks. Until one day he disappeared completely. 6 months later, he was found in a roadside ditch with his head broken off. That's how my father ended his life. Mother was not lagging behind either. She didn't wait for her husband. Didn't leave the house. She drank every penny she earned cleaning and scrubbing floors in the local diner after she got her paycheck. The only thing Jason remembered from his childhood was being alone and hungry. Emily's not expensive. Eventually, she got to the point of white fever, after which she was hospitalized. Only an old grandmother, half deaf and half blind. The grandmother sat with her grandson as long as she could. Jason was sent to boarding school from time to time. I can't cope. I'm old, like bringing up children. In the end, his mom was deprived of parental rights, and his grandmother died soon after. And him, Jason, to an orphanage? Where else? So he decided after that I'd do anything, but I'd never repeat my parents' life. What was it? His parents' genes opening up. Jason thought about his unexpected drunkenness, sitting at his desk and trying to concentrate on his work. Finally, pulling himself together, he dialed the number of one of his partners and put it on speakerphone. His head was still buzzing. He wanted to sleep again. That's it, not another drop in my mouth, he decided, gathering his thoughts. Soon his partner answered. Jason turned his thoughts to business. The conversation with his partner was going to be difficult. Now it was imperative that he come up with a good reason for disrupting the meeting. Jason didn't think of himself as cunning and clever for nothing. By being himself, he had managed to build a reputation for being businesslike and practical. After a 10-minute conversation, the partner was disappointed at the disruption of an important meeting. Jason exhaled a sigh of relief. This time the unpleasantness had been resolved, but the partner had clearly hinted that there would be no second time. Whether he believed Jason's clever excuse about the car breaking down on the backcountry highway and the phone going dead, he didn't know. Probably not. But the important thing was that the meeting was postponed for 10 days. Jason had no margin for error. Lunchtime approached. After instructing his secretary, Jason decided to have lunch at an Italian restaurant nearby. His favorite lasagna wasn't working tonight. My wife's a better cook, he thought, and called the waiter over to pay. Remembering Emily, he frowned again. "Girl, it's Ashley. We need to do something about her." Unlike his wife, Jason had never dreamed of becoming a father. His main dream was to become rich and successful. The experience of his own childhood discouraged him from becoming a parent by abandoning his pregnant girlfriend. He never regretted it. The fact that there were no children in their family didn't really upset him. Well, it doesn't work out. So what now? Too bad about Emily, of course. She's a good wife. Would have made a great mother, Jason thought to himself. Well, there you go, you've got a daughter. He hadn't felt any warm emotions toward Ashley since he'd been a father. All he saw in the girl was a reflection of the friend he'd abandoned years ago and her curses. Those thoughts infuriated him. Just as he was furious that his calm and reasonable wife had suddenly taken such a firm and stubborn stand on the unwanted daughter. After paying for lunch, Jason decided to drive to a facility outside of town and then home from there. Unable to trust people completely, he liked to oversee the work himself. His favorite expression was, "If you want it done well, do it yourself." Construction was in full swing. It took about 2 hours to settle business matters and check the progress of the work. As Jason got ready to go home, he was again stuck in traffic at the entrance to the city. The traitorous drowsiness had set in again. He fought sleep as he drove, wondering how he could make his daughter want to leave home. Suddenly his dream was gone. Jason remembered that the watch his wife Emily had given him the day before was missing from his hand. There, he thought, "Hang on now, daughter. There's no watch. And where is it? I don't know. It's a good watch, expensive." But everything the dream was gone. The traffic jam had finally moved. Jason braked sharply, and a car stopped right in front of him. He was already thinking of a plan of action, preparing to play the role of the offended benefactor of the theft. He decided to act immediately. When he pulled up to the house tonight, Jason was too lazy to put the car in the garage and left it outside. He entered the gate. As he walked down the driveway toward the house, he suddenly heard his daughter's happy laughter and his wife Emily's joyful voice, answering her. "Nasty girl," Jason thought to himself, "but that's all right. You won't have long to be happy. You'll leave this house and everything will be as it was before, nice and quiet." The front door to the cottage was unlocked. Quietly entering the house, Jason saw an unpleasant sight from the hallway. Emily was sitting on the couch and Ashley was standing next to her with one foot on her heel. They were laughing merrily, twirling her from side to side. On the girl's slender, graceful foot was a slipper with a small heel, the kind of shoe that young girls like to wear. Not yet mastering the art of walking in real heels, Emily looked pleased and happy as she watched the girl. "What the hell is that?" Jason roared. It was clear that Emily had bought her daughter new shoes, and that spurred Jason's determination to kick Ashley out of his house at all costs. But it wasn't even that pissed him off the most. His daughter's slender ankle and narrow knee resembled his mother's beautiful legs. A witch. She's a witch again. That's it. Hold on, Jason thought. Seeing her husband in the doorway, Emily quickly jumped up. "Alcohol," Jason yelled. "Did you know that girl is a thief?" He pushed Ashley onto the couch. "Take off your shoes." Now Jason ripped the shoes off the girl's feet and tossed them into the corner. "Get out of here." "What are you talking about?" Emily shouted, pulling the crying Ashley against her. "Or did you get drunk again somewhere along the way? Think what you're saying." "I am thinking," the man bellowed back. "These are thieves and scoundrels. You shouldn't give presents, you should call the police." He pointed to the wrist of the hand on which he usually wore the watch given by his wife. "See where my watch is? Yes, your gift for our wedding anniversary. I've looked everywhere for it. It's nowhere to be found. And it seems to me that you little bum, took the watch. There's no one else." Emily was silent. "Take it easy," she said. She realized that the old Jason, with whom she had been so in love and with whom she had lived the happy years of her marriage, was not coming back. She no longer recognized her husband, or simply didn't know him. Suddenly she felt bitter and tears of disappointment glistened in her eyes. How can you blame Ashley? Couldn't you have lost them yourself during your drunken binge? By the way, you still haven't explained to me where you were and why you didn't show up home like that. Until 24 hours later, Emily said, looking at her husband sternly. Where was I? I'm going to call the police right now and we're going to find out where I was, Jason yelled furiously right in his daughter's face. You better get out of the house yourself. Jason, that's enough. You already know perfectly well that she didn't do it, Emily said. Ashley clung to her shoulder in fear. She was trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mom, I didn't take that watch, she said through her tears. I didn't see it. I know, daughter. And I don't doubt it, Emily kissed the girl. You don't have to leave our house, for it's not your fault at all. She's not your daughter, Jason was already dialing the police number in a blind rage. Hello, police? I've been robbed, he told the officer on duty, giving the address. A watch my wife gave me as a gift is missing. Yes, an expensive one. It's definitely not at home. Soon the police arrived. Ashley wanted to leave the house several times, but Emily dissuaded her, reasoning that her departure would look like a flight from justice. The girl trembled and clutched silently to Emily's shoulder. After interviewing Jason as the victim, the police asked Ashley to return the watch if she had taken it. The girl did not confess. The police officers then asked permission to search Ashley's room. However, the watch was neither found nor recovered. Having gone on a bender, Jason had absolutely no recollection of the circumstances under which his item might have gone missing. His intoxication had been so strong at the time that he remembered nothing at all. He kept quiet about it, however, certain that Ashley would be picked up on suspicion anyway. When they had finished questioning him, the officers told him that they would have to go to the police station and file a missing persons report. They were taking Ashley with them as a suspect. Emily was going to go with them to the station as well. Jason, she's just a kid. Look at her, Emily tried to appeal to her husband's conscience. She really did, Ashley, being a mere 16 years old, looked like a teenager. Small, very thin, she rarely smiled and looked like a hungry stray kitten. And only the bright blue, huge eyes like her mother's gave her away as not a child, but a very young girl. Nothing. She's no child. She's got a passport. And she smoked in half her face. Let her deal with it, Jason smirked wickedly. He was sure the girl was going to be detained until they found out what was going on, and then it would be over. A police car. As they say, a man's a man and a story's a story. Ashley doomed herself and the cops. They waited patiently in the hallway as Emily suddenly said to them, I want to confess. Let the girl go. I'm the one who took the watch. I had a fight with my husband. I decided to get back at him, so I took it secretly. I sold it in a back alley at the market dressed like a beggar for nothing. I don't remember to whom. I wanted to spite my husband more, because he has changed a lot lately. He became rude, started drinking. We fight about everything, so take me away. This is all my fault, not Ashley. The police officers looked at Jason in surprise and asked if he was willing to write a statement for his own wife. Jason, dumbfounded, remained silent. This was not exactly the turn he had expected. The policeman repeated the question, as if pushing them toward their new job. A walkie-talkie went off muffled in the pocket of one of them. No, of course I won't, Jason replied in confusion. One thing he realized was that the girl had managed to beat him again. With an angry, capitulating wave of his hand, a final spit, and a deliberately loud drowning in protest, he walked up the stairs to his office, went inside, and slammed the door as hard as he could. The police officers left to go about their business, realizing that the conflict was over. It was just an ordinary domestic quarrel, they decided, immediately forgetting about the incident. All the more so when an urgent call came in. A drunken brawl had broken out in a restaurant on a neighboring street, with stabbing and casualties. As the police drove away and Jason retired to his office, Emily hugged Ashley and said, gently pressing her cheek against her crying cheeks, "Don't cry, daughter. I won't let anyone hurt you now. Don't be afraid of anything and wear your shoes. Don't be afraid. And if necessary, we'll leave this place altogether. I'm quite well off without him, without a husband. My father saved up a dowry for me before Jason and I married, and now, after all these years, the money is multiplied. I've managed to invest it well in my time, so we'll be able to live on the interest it's earned. And I have an apartment. This apartment, a gift from my father, and now we rent it to a tenant. And if we want to, you and I can live in it apart from Jason. Let's go to dinner. Everything's ready. Jason closed himself in his office on the second floor, sat down at his desk in a high-backed leather chair, and thought darkly. What was happening to him now, he didn't understand at all. Always fixated on his work and thinking mainly about profit, income, and succeeding in life. He kept catching himself thinking that all of that had now taken a back seat. The well-established business that had been running for many years and was working perfectly seemed to have reacted to his current state by starting to give the first alarm signals. The unexpectedly lost tender had unpleasantly surprised Jason. What could have happened that a competitor who had always lagged behind him would suddenly bypass his company so easily? Trouble, as we know, does not come alone. It was confirmed by that wild, sudden drinking spree that had started out of nowhere during a meeting at the bar and ended with a hangover that still gave Jason a headache. Once again, a blow to his business. Missing such an important meeting when a much-needed tender had been lost. Jason clenched his fists. It all felt like the pent-up revenge of a once-jilted girlfriend, as if her curses were now being fulfilled in his life. After all, it was no coincidence that this girl had shown up right now. Jason thought it was as if the girl's mother had risen from the grave like a sinister ghost and was staring at him with a piercing, witchy gaze. Jason shuddered and jumped up in his chair. He had dozed off under the weight of his thoughts and saw the frightening image as if it were real. For the first time in years, he felt like a helpless, lonely, hungry boy, like he had in his long-gone childhood. Jason felt like he was losing control of the situation. He simply didn't recognize himself. A sudden thought pierced through him. Were my affairs as good as I thought they were? In the past year, he had noticed signs of the current problems. Partners and suppliers had expressed dissatisfaction with his business practices on several occasions. Yes, he was overconfident at times. Yes, he put his own interests first, sidelining partners. But this is business, not child's play. He always justified himself the strongest man wins, and the strongest man is usually right. Not girly worries, but real business. His behavior in business matters sometimes angered others. But despite this, he got away with it. However, the tender turned out to be lost in a bad way. Jason realized how often he had risked everything recklessly, but had won until the last moment. But not now. The lost tender needed to close the budget gap had gone out of his hands. A lucrative contract with now resentful partners, and a disrupted meeting were his last hope to make things right. And that's where he went wrong. Jason could taste the brandy on his tongue as he remembered the binge. At the same instant, he had a strong urge to drink. That's weird. I'm a non-drinker. Never drank because of family genes. The urge to drink grew stronger. Jason could barely contain himself. What's going on? Maybe I'm sick, or am I going crazy? Emily. She always understood him in every situation. It was enough to put his head in her lap and all troubles went away. But right now, Emily was preoccupied with this girl. Jason didn't want to think of Ashley as his daughter for a second. And now she'd also broken them up with her appearance. Damn the day that foul-mouthed tramp suddenly appeared in the hallway. Jason gritted his teeth furiously. Why hadn't he thrown her out right away? It was dark outside the study window. The house was quiet. Emily and Ashley went to their rooms and went to bed. Night had fallen. Jason was about to go to bed in the study, but he realized that the drowsiness that had been plaguing him all day had suddenly disappeared. Now he wanted to approach Emily and apologize for his rude behavior. Jason didn't have the courage, even though he knew he would do it. Even a wise wife would have forgiven him, and everything would have fallen into place. But the girl, she now came between them, taking all of his wife's attention for herself. Jason knew Emily would surely condition herself to accept the homeless girl as her daughter. To what the hell? He had nothing to apologize for. This wife had betrayed him, dragged the little wretch into his house without asking, which meant it wasn't his fault, but hers. Sleep had receded completely, and Jason realized he wasn't going to get any sleep. It was a warm summer night. Jason grabbed his jacket and car keys, put his phone in his pants pocket, and left the house. The city had fallen asleep. Silence took over the deserted streets. Bright stars shone in the clear sky. Jason stood outside the cottage fence, breathing in the warm night air. There was a rustle in the bushes nearby, like a small bird flitting from branch to branch. Then came a melodious sound. Just like when he was a child in his grandmother's village, Jason thought. The car was parked in its place by the gate. Jason got behind the wheel, started the engine, and decided to drive wherever he wanted to go, hoping that the peaceful motion of the car would help him sleep. He drove slowly through the city, not lingering at intersections. The traffic lights were off as night fell. Finally, he stopped, feeling a rush of drowsiness, deciding to fall asleep right there in the car. Not to lose the sleep that had returned, Jason realized he was insanely thirsty. He looked around from the open car window, the windows of a nightclub glowing softly behind the sidewalk. Jason got out, closed the car, and walked through its open doors. The bar was quiet, with only the sound of slow, soft music. There weren't many patrons. In the middle of the room, a couple stood on the dance floor, swaying sleepily, arms around each other. Jason sat down on a high stool behind the bar and asked the bartender for a glass of cold water and a non-alcoholic cocktail with citrus juice and ice. Slowly sipping the cool drink, Jason relaxed and finally felt calm and confident. What was the big deal anyway? Scary at this point. The tender has been lost. There was an option with partners willing to invest in his project. A meeting broke down. So what? He, as in the old days, managed to convince a partner offended by the disruption. And now there's a new date, important meetings. You and your wife have a fight. That's a problem. They're just as likely to fight as they are to make up. Jason always knew that Emily adored him from the beginning of their relationship, and that meant one thing. A woman who loved him would forgive him. Jason was absolutely certain of that. Did he love his wife? Jason, in all the years of marriage, had never asked himself that question. As a commercial, business-minded man, he thought in very different terms. How much of anything is good for me? How much is not? His marriage to Emily he certainly considered favorable and successful for himself. After all, it was from this event that the story of his success in life began. And love. You can't boil porridge with it, and you can't put it on bread, Jason joked when the subject came up. Friends of friends, former buddies of his youth from the working-class suburbs of Los Angeles. Many of them married for love, had children like themselves, but with the same factory and beer hall around the corner. Did love give them much happiness in life? Jason categorically did not understand the expression heaven is for the sweetheart and considered this phrase to be the most soothing excuse for desperate losers. Heaven is when you have a nice, comfortable house and a solid bank account, he thought. And love is like that, in a hovel. Even the biggest and strongest has a good chance of coming to naught, Jason was sure. His personal happiness had always been measured in material terms: money, income, success in life. And the fact that a man could have both love in his life and wealth, Jason didn't allow for that. He just didn't believe in it and considered it a beautiful fairy tale for silly young girls. As Jason downed his cocktail, he calmed down and pulled himself together. As before, he was soberly assessing the situation and thinking in cold blood. The only thing left was the girl, he thought. All right, she can wait. I'll think of a way to get rid of her later. It would be the last thing I'd ever do to fight with my wife over this abomination. Don't forget that Emily wasn't poor either. When Jason's business had gotten into money trouble, his wife's savings had helped him out. Jason didn't use it often, only as a last resort. All the more so because Emily herself believed that these funds should be a reliable safety cushion for her personally. For the most unforeseen event in life, sometimes taking unnecessary risks in business. Jason always remembered his wife's savings, expecting to use them in a difficult situation. And of course, a fight with his wife would not be good for him right now. He needed to make peace with Emily and pretend to accept Ashley's presence in the house. There you are, all of you, Jason thought, clenching his fist. He got off the chair and was about to go home when he felt a firm tap on his shoulder and heard a drunken voice in his ear. Brother, is that you? And I come in, I look, you're not you, I can't understand. If it's not you, why does this dude look so much like you? Or did I have too much to drink, grinning so drunk? Jason was facing the same unexpected drinking buddy, Tyler, that had gotten him into this whole mess with the law and the deal breaker. How did he even get here, Jason thought. I guess he just dropped in unnoticed. I was so busy with my own thoughts that I missed it. I can't believe that face. So, I'm thinking. Tyler began. Wait, my throat's dry. He sipped a good half of the glass he was holding. It smelled like a cloud of strong alcohol. So I'm thinking, he continued, and if it's you and not some other dude, then why? Tyler gave a drunken laugh. Jason got the impression that his buddy had already taken a lot on his chest somewhere before and was going to start drunkenly vomiting, right now. And here he pulled away from him, just in case. And if it's you, then why are you drinking some compote here, like a woman on the gossip circuit? Tyler continued to smirk. Satisfied with himself, he laughed wildly again, stuttering. Jason took advantage of the moment to make a sneaky exit and headed for the door. Tyler, however, reacted quickly to his attempt to leave, grabbing Jason's sleeve tightly. "You're not a man, are you?" he said dismissively. "I'm just kidding. No offense, bro. Knowing that you're a man, he wouldn't lie to me. How was it last time? Or don't you remember anything? It was pretty heavy. You remember the cat from last time?" Tyler winked and sipped noisily from his glass. Jason was stunned. No Lita. And had there been something between them or not? And that he had absolutely no recollection of. Except for the drunk lady in bed next to him, with makeup smeared on her face and her hair disheveled like an old mop. And whether this same Lita or someone else was there. The memories made Jason nauseous, but he couldn't remember the details. He thought apprehensively, trying to free himself from Tyler's grip, and to get away. But Tyler was determined not to give up so easily, gripping his sleeve tightly. "Brother, what's your name?" Jason sure remembered brother, he said. "Oh, really? It's kid time. Stay out till morning. My wife kicked me out of the house. Can you imagine? Let's have a drink to that. Hey, bartender." "My best friend. A small shot of cognac." Tyler, a big, burly man, almost 6 feet tall, was already dragging Jason back to the bar. Jason suddenly found himself sitting at the bar again, a glass in his hand. Well, except for a drop. Jason thought, taking a sip from the glass. Tyler was already reaching for him with a new toast and a new drink. Suddenly there was a murmur of voices at the entrance to the bar, and Jason thought he was having déjà vu all over again. "What people?" Tyler yelled. "Speak of the devil. Here come the girls. We've been waiting for you girls." Tyler winked, holding a filled glass in his hand, and wrapped his other arm around one of the new arrival's lush thighs. "I'd like to meet you, bro. This is Catherine, my girlfriend. Not just mine, though. A lot of other people's." "What's the difference? We're going out now." Jason was relieved to realize that the notorious Lita hadn't come with the group. The alcohol was starting to fog his mind, and he didn't want to leave. Well, I can always leave, he thought, taking another sip of cognac. Catherine was already seated next to him, shooting sly eyes at Jason and leaning languidly against the counter with her lush, open-chested breasts. Jason ordered her a cocktail and took a closer look at his unexpected neighbor. Catherine's face was already showing signs of a promiscuous life, and from her knowing glances she wasn't exactly a looker. "Don't touch that." Jason was already squinting and had completely forgotten that he'd just left. Catherine glanced at his expensive suit and moved closer to Jason, inadvertently catching him with her lush bust that was fading from her cleavage. The fun was picking up. Jason was getting more and more intoxicated and couldn't stop. He felt good now, and even the slightly wrinkled look of Catherine pressed against him was not repulsive. It wasn't long before the company had had enough of the fun and decided to move on to somewhere else. When Tyler heard that Jason had arrived by car, he announced in an unapologetic tone that everyone was going to Jason's house right away, taking Jason, who was barely standing on his feet, along with him. The drunken group, led by Tyler, poured out into the street and made their way to Jason's car, taking the car keys from him. Tyler struggled to squeeze into the driver's seat. The rest of the group squeezed Jason into the back seat and barely fit in the car. Jason realized he was between two girls, one of whom was again Catherine. "Where do you live?" Tyler asked, starting the car and looking at Jason's drunken face. Do you remember your address? Jason woke up and strained his memory. His head was buzzing, but he remembered the address. The car shifted, driving the noisy group away. Jason felt sick and fell asleep. He woke to someone tugging on his shoulder. When Jason opened his eyes, he felt himself being pulled into the street and realized that the car was parked in front of a house. A light was on in the first floor window of the house. The curtains parted, and Emily looked out the window, awakened by the noise of the company. But the party was already up the stairs, taking the keys to the front door from Jason, who was barely on his feet. Tyler was already picking the lock. The drunken group, squeezing Jason between the two girls, tumbled out into the hallway under Emily's surprised gaze. Unable to believe what she was seeing, Emily, in her nightgown and negligee, stared at the scene in silence. Ashley was already coming down the stairs to the second floor, awakened by the noise. She stood fearfully on the bottom step. "Hello," Emily bowed jokingly to Ashley, and the company shouted drunkenly, "Mademoiselle, my respects. May I have your pen?" Tyler tried to grab Ashley's hand. The girl shrieked and rushed upstairs to her room. This set off another explosion of laughter. "And you must be our friend's wife," Tyler said, looking around at Emily. "He's invited us over to his place, so we're going to hang out here for a while. What about you? We've got our own refreshments. I'd like to organize some appetizers if you don't mind." And Tyler was leading the drunken party into the living room. "Get out of here," Emily said sternly. "And take your friend with you." This is his house too." Tyler pushed Emily out into the hallway with his fat belly. "So you're going to have to accept the fact that his best friends are here to visit. You don't want a scandal, do you?" And the young hottie. "Who is she? Is she your daughter? She might get scared. And we don't want that, do we?" Tyler looked into the kitchen, noticed the glasses, picked them up and carried them into the living room. Unable to fight the situation, Emily retreated upstairs to her room. Loudly, the heads of the company settled in the living room. The merriment continued. Unaccustomed to such doses of strong alcohol, they were already snoring sweetly in the corner of the couch standing in the living room, paying no attention to the others. The rest of the group, led by Tyler, continued to party. One of the buddies ran to the nearest supermarket and soon returned with a large bag of groceries and a new batch of strong alcohol. Greeted by joyful shouts, he placed the loot on the coffee table, and the fun continued with renewed vigor. It was getting light by the time the party had exhausted the company. One by one, they began to fall asleep. Jason, who had spoken up during their drinking, woke up. He sat up on the couch and looked around in amazement until he was inexpressibly surprised to find himself in his own home. Jason had expected to see anything but his living room. Emily clutched her head in horror. She'd seen his drunken party, and the girls too, who were not of the most exemplary behavior. Barely able to get up, Jason went to the bathroom. He threw up, he brushed his teeth and shaved. With shaking hands, he stood under the cold shower for a few minutes, trying to collect his thoughts. Jason felt small again, trembling with fear of the unknown, a boy losing control of what was happening. He changed into a terry robe and went into the kitchen to make himself a strong, unsweetened cup of coffee. The drinking buddies were sound asleep in a heap all around the living room. His wife and daughter were nowhere to be seen. After the silence had fallen, they must have finally been able to sleep soundly. Jason went up to his office, sat down at his desk and leaned back in his chair, resting his outstretched legs on it. Settling down, he adjusted himself for the workday, trying to start taking control of his life again, despite the intrusive rattling in his head. There was a wild urge to hangover, but Jason held on, realizing he'd overdone it again. This time it was complicated by the fact that his wife had seen the full extent of his fall, including the cheerful girls. How would he explain himself to her? Jason pondered and couldn't find an answer. These thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of the door opening. Jason lifted his head and shuddered in surprise. It seemed to him that he was more sober than his eyes had realized, a horrible hallucination. A thin, barefoot woman's foot slowly slipped through the opening. Jason went cold with horror. He thought it looked exactly like Ashley's dead mother's foot. He clutched his neck and stared at the door, as if he expected to see his former friend rising from the grave. But there was a soft laugh, and Catherine's recent drinking companion slipped through the doorway into the study. Jason was stunned at the sight of her, her skin glistening with water droplets. It looked like she'd just taken a shower. She was dressed in a single towel wrapped around her body, barely holding on to her lush bust. The pretty girl, swaying her hips as she walked slowly over to the table. "Good morning, sweetie," she said, sitting down on the edge of the table and leaning toward her coworker, giving off the fumes of alcohol. "I took a little swim here. You don't mind, I hope? I wake up and see you're gone. I went to look for you, and then I looked in the bathroom. You're standing under the shower. I wanted to join you, but then I decided to surprise you." She bent down even lower, and the towel slid open and slid down, unable to withstand the pressure of her lush bust. Before Jason knew it, Catherine was sitting on his lap, her wet arm around his neck. Jason stared in horror and wonder. Well, something like that is what I expected to see. His wife stood in the doorway of the study. "I wanted to talk, but now I see there's nothing to talk about. That's it. Ashley and I are leaving and staying with my parents for now, and then my apartment will be available. I'll call the realtor today so we can look for a new place next month," Emily said softly and left. Jason remained silent, shocked by the situation, realizing that all excuses to his wife would be useless. Catherine, pleased with the turn of events, smiled silently, sitting on his lap and wrapping her arm around his neck, her eyes fixed on the wealthy man. This was roughly what she'd hoped for when she'd started the shower and towel story. The plan had worked. The wife was leaving for good. Finally, Jason rose abruptly from his chair, dropping the girl from his lap. "Get out of here. Go. Tell my wife that nothing happened between us and you were just kidding. Well, quick, who am I telling?" He dragged the girl toward the door. Downstairs, the front door slammed. Jason looked out into the yard. Emily, along with Ashley, walked outside, each carrying a small suitcase. Emily pulled her car out of the garage, got behind the wheel, drove out of the yard, and they drove off, loading the things into the trunk. Jason stood silently at the window, watching. "There, you see, you don't have to go anywhere else." Catherine, silently approaching the window, watched with satisfaction, pressed herself against her colleague and hugged him from behind, wrapping her arms around his stomach. Her bright red manicured hand slowly slid across the floor of his terracloth bathrobe. Suddenly, Jason felt as if he'd deflated. He didn't care what was going on. They asked for it, he thought to both his wife and Catherine at the same time. A moment later, he and Catherine were in his and Emily's marital bedroom. Morning came. After kicking the guests out, Jason left for work. For a month and a half now, Emily and Ashley had been living separately. She and Jason hadn't seen each other since the fight. Jason thought about calling his wife, but when he realized that his desire to kick the girl out of the house had come true, he calmed down and changed his mind. If there was anything he cared about now, it was his own business. Jason's business was getting worse. The meeting with the partners he'd hoped for had fallen short of his expectations. The partners offered new, less favorable terms of cooperation. This meant that Jason's business was in a serious financial hole. Jason was nervous, trying to find a way out, but he decided not to ask Emily for help just yet. His new friends, led by Tyler, were now hanging out at his house. Catherine, satisfied that she'd kicked Jason's wife out of the house on any plausible pretext, was more and more likely to stay at his place for a few days. As Jason's girlfriend, she constantly asked him for money for one thing or another. When he tried to explain that he didn't have any extra money at the moment, and that his business was in trouble. Without saying a word, Catherine pulled Jason into bed, often getting her way. Jason had been planning to kick Catherine out of his life for a long time. But the obsessive and cunning girlfriend, as if reading his thoughts, always turned the situation so that her expulsion was postponed time after time. There were various reasons for this. The plumbing in the house suddenly broke down, and Catherine was faithfully on duty waiting for the locksmiths. While Jason was at work, the electricity was strangely short-circuited. And one day the girlfriend even called an ambulance to the house with suspected acute poisoning. The ambulance had pumped her stomach and advised bed rest for the next couple of days. Jason sighed. He had enough to worry about. Without her clever scheming, Jason was finding new problems to deal with. He was drinking regularly now, aided by Catherine's constant presence in his house. She was a big fan of the collar. The frequent drinking had taken its toll on Jason's appearance. Sometimes in the mornings, barely awake after a heady sleep, He'd show up at work looking like a real slacker, not having time to clean himself up after another binge. One day, drunk, Jason stopped by his wife's apartment, deciding to ask her for help in case of an emergency. Ashley opened the door, hugging Jason from the doorway with her piercing blue gaze. At the sight of her daughter, Jason's rage returned. He pushed the girl away and stormed out the door. Emily came out to the noise. When she saw her husband on the doorstep, she grimaced with annoyance. "Why do you want to be here?" she asked and waved her hand at Ashley, asking her to leave the scandal in her room. Ashley reluctantly left, fearing that her father would hit Emily. "You see, it's all because of her, that little tramp," he said angrily, adjusting the collar of his freshly crumpled shirt. "She's the one who brought that little wretch into the house, and that's what started all this mess. All because of her and her witch mother." "Yeah, I remember, Jason. You've never been like that," Emily said hotly. "It's not about the girl. You're the cause of your own misery. Don't you see? Anyone else would be glad that you had a daughter, that you had a chance to make up for your mistakes by recognizing her and being a real father to her. But instead, you're shifting all the responsibility onto a child who is not to blame for being born. From an irresponsible man like you. Look what you've become." Emily pointed to the mirror hanging on the wall. "You're turning into a crude, filthy animal, blaming it on another human being. I understand that you're going through a rough time, but you're the cause of it, not Ashley. You're radiating so much hate and fear, and it's attracting more problems." Emily was silent, staring at her husband. "I'm thirsty," Jason said suddenly. He realized there would be no conversation. Sighing, Emily fetched a glass of water. She drank it greedily and demanded more. He was thirsty after last night's raucous party and Catherine working beside him. Emily brought more water and hurried her husband out. Jason hurried home. Catherine called to let him know that she was waiting for him at the table. Suddenly, he had a craving for a drink now. Not waiting at home, Jason stopped at the nearest bar. He'd had a good drink with two of the other regulars. Barely on his feet, he got behind the wheel and hit the road, driving on autopilot. He drove most of the way, already almost entering the city. Jason suddenly blacked out behind the wheel. The car lost control and flipped into a roadside ditch. When he woke up from the impact and realized what had happened, Jason struggled to get out of the car and looked around. The single-story houses of the suburbs were not far away. The domes of the church peeked out from the treetops, swaying from side to side. Jason shuddered at the thought that he could have been killed in the accident. The thought sobered him a little. Lucky, he grinned mentally and headed down the highway toward town. It wasn't as close as he thought it would be. When the fence of the church loomed close, Jason realized that his strength had deserted him. He sat down on the ground beneath a roadside bush and fell into a deep sleep. How long Jason slept, he did not know. By the time he reached the suburbs on foot, it was dark, the streets were empty, and Jason lay on the ground, sound asleep, unnoticed by anyone. Suddenly, his sleep was interrupted. Someone was rubbing his shoulder insistently. Jason opened his eyes and saw a face with a long gray beard leaning over him in the twilight. "Alive. Praise the Virgin Mary." Jason heard. "I saw a man lying there not breathing. I touched your shoulder. I see he's awake. Wake up, good man. You shouldn't be lying here." A passerby helped Jason to his feet. "Where are you from? Are you here? Let's go to my place for the night, and tomorrow we'll pull your car out," the man said when Jason explained what had happened to him. The man who had awakened him was a priest from the local church. When he finished his business, he locked the church and found Jason sleeping at the gate on his way home. When he brought him home, Father John, as the priest was called, set a simple meal on the table, inviting Jason to eat with him. A simple jacket potato with sunflower oil and fresh cucumber tasted better than any of the dishes in an expensive restaurant. Like his grandmother's village, he thought, setting the kettle and glasses on the table. And Father John asked, "Well, do you drink? Would you tell me what kind of trouble you're trying to get away from? It might make you feel better." Jason hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of talking about his affairs without trusting people. This priest, however, could hardly hurt him. So Jason, waving off that habit, began to talk. Father John listened in silence, not interrupting, and occasionally asking questions. Then he said, "I understand what has happened to you. If you need advice, now you listen." It was Jason's turn to listen. Surprisingly, he suddenly realized that his wife Emily had told him the same thing more than once. Father Ben was a man of wisdom and judgment. His smooth, sedate speech and old-fashioned manners commanded respect. Jason liked the fact that Father Ben did not scold him, but gently admonished him. There was no judgment in his voice. "There's a reason I was in that accident. I might not have lived to see this moment. I guess it was a sign, like I'm not living right," Jason thought suddenly. He rubbed the bump on his forehead, which must have popped up from the impact with the glass during the accident. It was late at night when Father Ben began to make Jason's bed. The priest had a service at the temple in the morning. As he lay on the rickety cot under the meager blanket, Jason felt as if he were back in his childhood. Night in an old farmhouse. The sounds of grasshoppers coming from the open window outside reminded him of his time at his grandmother's house in the country. Through his light slumber, Jason kept thinking about what Father Ben had said to him, about the events of his present life, about his wife and daughter, about the accident. He didn't fall soundly asleep until morning. Jason woke up close to noon. There were hot potatoes on the table, bread on the table, and a glass jar of milk. Father Ben had long since returned. "After breakfast I'll make tea. Here's the neighbor just in for lunch. He works on the tractor himself. Can he help you get your car out of the ditch?" "Let's go and ask him," Father Ben said. Jason suddenly remembered that he hadn't taken out his cell phone since the accident. He found it in place in his jacket pocket. However, the phone never turned on. To Jason's surprise, the car was not damaged at all and started immediately. "Apparently I fell asleep at the wheel. I slowed down and the car lost control and rolled into a ditch." "Lucky," Jason said thoughtfully, realizing that it could have ended very differently. "Remember what I told you. God gives everyone a chance." "Well, I'll keep coming back to visit," Father Ben said. Jason bade him a warm farewell and left. As he pondered on the road, he realized that everything that had happened to him lately had not been accidental. That accident, the impact of his head against the windshield, had shaken Jason from the inside out. He knew now that he needed to talk to his wife and Ashley. He also realized that he wouldn't be the same. Standing at a stoplight, Jason pulled out his phone again. To his surprise, and as if in response to his thoughts, the phone suddenly turned on, ignoring the numerous missed call alerts. Unable to wait for it for the feast, Jason dialed his wife's number and made an appointment for the evening. When he arrived at work, Jason received some unpleasant news. His partner in the project was suing him for failure to fulfill his obligations. The only thing that could stop this was an immediate indemnification of the partner's company. However, Jason didn't have the funds for that right now. As he dealt with work issues throughout the day, he thought tirelessly about how to resolve the matter, but found no solution. New debts would only make things worse, especially since the partner was accusing Jason's company of fraud, which meant that no one would simply lend him any more money. Several times during the day, the unbearable urge to get drunk came on. Each time, however, he saw Father Ben in his mind's eye, as if he were hearing his words again. Jason shrugged off the thoughts. On that evening, he rang the doorbell of his wife's apartment. Ashley opened the door when she saw her father at the door. She looked at him with fear in her piercing blue eyes. Emily came out into the hallway. Ashley wanted to leave right away, but Jason, calling her by name for the first time, asked his daughter to stay. Emily and Ashley looked at him, not expecting anything good. The conversation had been long and difficult for Jason, but his wife and daughter were getting brighter and brighter as they listened to him. Ashley even smiled at her father for the first time. It was clear now that she had a daddy who recognized her as his daughter. Emily couldn't believe her happiness, but she wanted to go home tonight. Jason, however, asked her to postpone her return. He needed to get the house in order for their arrival. On the way home, he ordered on the phone with a cleaning company for tomorrow a complete cleaning of the house, which during the absence of his wife had turned into a garbage dump. Catherine could hardly be forced to at least wash the glasses for the guests. Entering the house, he found the remnants of the feast in the living room. Their friend sleeping there under the television, he rasped, explaining that she was immediately leaving not only his house, but his life as well. Without listening to her feignedly pathetic excuses, Jason led a leaning Catherine outside the wicket. Then he resolutely poured the rest of the alcohol down the sink and blocked all of the drinking buddies' numbers, including Tyler's and Amber's ex-girlfriend. A day later, Emily and Ashley were already moving into their home together, fully cleaned and spruced up. It was fall. Things had settled down in the family. Ashley went to school. Harmony between the couple gradually returned. But things were getting worse in Jason's business. The court date was approaching, and the means to settle the conflict had not been found. Emily's savings were not up to the task. Much more was needed. Knowing her husband's fiery temper, Emily tried her best to assure him that there would be a way out of the situation and supported him in every way possible. Jason periodically visited Ben's father. Each time he received support from the priest and even introduced his wife and daughter to him. Father Ben always told Jason, "Remember that according to faith, everyone will be rewarded, and so will you. Believe in the Lord, in yourself, in your strength, in the love of your family, in life." And Jason believed no matter what. And one morning, Emily pulled a letter out of the mailbox. When she read the letter, her face bloomed with happiness. Ashley had come home from school. Emily let her read the letter as well, and together they started calling Jason, who had left for work, to tell him the happy news. The letter had come from a law firm that had tracked down Ashley as the heiress to a large fortune. The girl was surprised to learn that her uncle, her mother's brother, who had left for America in the 90s and never gave any more news about himself, was very successful. He accumulated a solid capital, acquired real estate, but never married and had no heirs. Making inquiries, his uncle found out that his sister had a daughter, but did not marry either. Thinking that what he had accumulated would eventually have to be left to someone, the uncle made a will in favor of his sister and his niece. And just in time. It was as if he had a premonition that a short time later he would die in a major car accident. Ashley didn't hesitate to help her father. Consequently, the court agreed to give Jason a reprieve until the daughter's inheritance rights kicked in. Jason's business was saved. Jason and his daughter Ashley and wife Emily often visit Ashley's birth mom's grave. They ordered a new monument and fence for her, making sure it's clean and bringing flowers to the grave each time. Jason thanks her every time for bringing such a wonderful daughter into their lives, his daughter Ashley. How Helen hated sad funeral ceremonies. Well, of course, no one asked her permission to live or go beyond the border, to a place from which no one could return. And now, as soon as she saw the inscription Julia, neighbor, on the smartphone screen, her heart sank with an unpleasant feeling. Helen, hello baby, it's Aunt Julia who worries. Sorry to bring you bad news this morning, but your father's phone isn't answering, so I have to bring grief down on you. George died. I was going to work and saw him sitting in an apple tree. I look, he seems to be doing something, half turning towards the street. Well, I waved to him and say, "Good morning." I asked what he was doing early in the morning, and George showed zero emotion to me, didn't even move. Although you know that my voice is loud, it's impossible not to hear. I went up to George, but he wasn't breathing. While I'm sitting here on the porch, I called all the necessary services, except for the ritual. It's not for me to decide how to see off George, but to be honest, I need to go to work. Would you come? Testedly responded in a hoarse voice. Of course, Aunt Julia, I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The sad news that her paternal grandfather, the always cheerful and cheerful George, had overcome the last milestone came as a real shock to Helen. We have to go, of course, organize everything, call everyone from grandfather's phone book. However, I wanted to convince myself that this conversation with my neighbor about my grandfather was just a bad dream. Now all you need to do is open your eyelids wide and look at the call history on your smartphone and make sure that there was no call. Unfortunately, this hope was not justified, and there really was a call from Aunt Valia, and the girl did everything possible to quickly get to her grandfather's house, located within the city, but in the so-called private sector. Having already got into the taxi car that had arrived on call, Helen asked her boss for a day off, then had a short conversation with her office colleague, explaining where the documents were, which, as luck would have it, the customers were supposed to come for today. The girl never dared to make the most difficult call. How to inform your father and mother, who have flown away on vacation to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, that they urgently need to return to say goodbye to grandfather George. Helen became sad. How unexpectedly this tragedy happened. Just the day before yesterday, she called her grandfather. He said that he was waiting for a visit and asked him to come quickly. Not for the sake of caring for a small garden, but to talk on some issue, to seek it. Helen promised to be there on the weekend that had recently flown by. She could have easily visited her grandfather, but she got a little sick, postponed the visit, called and apologized. They chatted for a bit about nothing. Grandfather George recalled the method that his wife Kristen and grandmother Helen always used. The girl listened that she needed to brew special herbs, wait until the infusion cooled to a pleasant warmth, stir a spoonful of honey in a glass of healing liquid, drink it, and lie down under the blanket. She promised that she would undergo intensive treatment and then visit him. And in the first month of autumn, when she had a vacation scheduled, the girl promised to stay with him for at least a week. Lord, how embarrassing. Now Helen was ashamed that she was going to wait for her vacation. After all, by public transport with transfers, you could get to grandfather in 45 minutes. When there were no traffic jams on the roads, you could even after work go not home, but to a loved one who had been incredibly bored alone for a little over a year. One over it was uneasy that she was a free girl and could easily keep a lonely grandfather company. It would be quite possible to go to work and back by taxi. Of course, it would be more expensive than using public transport, but it would be quick and comfortable. Alternatively, you could simply leave the house a little earlier in order to walk to the transport stop from which the tram of the required route departs. Everything could absolutely be resolved, sorted out somehow. But he didn't have the insight to understand that Grandpa George needed care and supervision, and his requests to come were not just the whim of a bored elderly man. Helen was tormented by a painful feeling of shame, and sighing, she tried to call her parents. However, both Mom and Dad's numbers were out of network coverage. The girl had to send a letter by email, hoping that the unpleasant news would be read not too late. While solving troubles and questions, the time on the way to my grandfather's house flew by unnoticed. Helen got out of the taxi and, listening to Aunt Valia's sympathetic remarks, felt real grief falling on her. The neighbor hugged the girl who arrived, asked her to hold on, and ran to work. Helen looked at her grandfather and kept expecting that now he would get up, stretch, and invite her to a tea party in the house or in the gazebo entwined with grapes. However, no miracle happened. Services, which arrived in response to a call from a neighbor, began another whirlwind of sad affairs associated with the passing of the older generation. The lady doctor confirmed the death of my grandfather, presumably from a heart attack. She recommended funeral agencies to the girl and explained that there were specialists working there who could organize mourning procedures with the most due respect for the deceased and sympathy for his relatives. Helen listened to the advice and tried with all her might to hold back bitter tears of despair. Only by lunchtime the girl was left alone. Helen entered her grandfather's house and burst into tears when she saw the phone on the table, which he apparently forgot on his last earthly morning. Probably if he had a cell phone, he would be able to call somewhere and ask for help. But it was impossible to change the past. Everything turned out the way it did. The girl discovered the cash, which her grandfather George and grandmother Kristen told her about shortly after she came of age. The man then tilted the rug hanging over the bed, gently pressed on one of the wooden panels, then with a slight movement moved it to the side. The surprised girl saw a deep vertical niche. Grandfather explained, "Here, granddaughter, Spetta and I are slowly putting money here so that it won't be a burden to anyone. You'll bury us with this money." Helen remembered how she began to grumble at her grandparents. She said that it was too early for them to think about such a topic. She assured that they would still have the opportunity to babysit their great-grandchildren. "No, my dear, that won't do. First, I will have to consider, approve, and then help raise the kids. Mom and Dad always have no time." Granny, patting her smiling granddaughter on the head, quietly objected. "Helen, we're not asking you whether it's too early for us to think about our last journey in this world or not. Just showing you so you know, just in case. After all, George already has an anniversary this year, 70 years old, and I'm not much younger. Alas, at that age anything can happen. Your parents, of course, also know about this hiding place. But you never know, maybe they'll be wary or start being modest." Grandfather George supported his wife. Now, we don't want to be a burden to you. So let's end the conversation. The grandmother hastened to change the topic and began to talk about the amusements of the selected kitten, simply nicknamed the man. Now, 6 years after this conversation, the skinny kid has turned into a well-fed, long, and independent, handsome man. The owner's departure was a real shock for the animal, and he even lost his excellent appetite for several days. However, grandfather George managed to pull the cat out of this state, and now this mission fell to Helen. It seemed to the girl that the orphan cat understood everything, and that's why he curled up on his grandfather's bed and didn't even react to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. The agencies recommended by our employee were indeed professional. A serious man suggested that Helen hold a farewell not at home, but in a special ritual hall at the cemetery. Getting there is much easier than here in the private sector, and even though the house is big, there will still be fuss, unnecessary fuss. The room there is convenient and comfortable. Everyone will be able to say goodbye calmly and without the crush that usually accompanies the removal of a body from an apartment or house. Everything will be both touching and civilized. Besides, understand, it will save you a lot of problems. The offer seemed reasonable to Helen, but she had to spend not only her meager savings but also her grandfather's stash to pay for funeral services. The girl did everything that was necessary. As if being in a state of sleep, she kept waiting for her parents to arrive, or at least answer the email, but in vain. The girl contacted the hotel where they had booked a room, but as we managed to understand from the answer in broken Russian, Mr. and Mrs. Hurd did not move in. They explained that they had decided to change plans a little. Helen was worried about her parents, but she couldn't do anything. Now clods of earth began to fall on the lid of grandfather George's coffin, but neither his son nor his daughter-in-law appeared. Words of condolences and sympathy were received by Helen, who had to listen to the lamentations of distant relatives who came to see the old man off on his last journey. Some spoke bluntly about the thoughtless son and daughter-in-law who did not appear at the mournful event. The girl defended her parents as best she could, and the guardians of other people's morality fell silent for a while, turning the conversation to other topics. Gradually, only relatives and closest neighbors remained at the funeral table, organized in a small cafe. Helen, who last saw most of them a little less than a year ago at farewell to grandmother Sveta, could hardly endure all the questions. She wanted to run away from the cafe as soon as possible, but she had to fulfill her granddaughter's duty to the very end. From time to time, she herself, along with the waiters, took out dirty dishes and brought funeral treats, just so as not to sit at the table listening to the conversations of those gathered growing louder. Quite by chance, Helen, while serving another portion of pies, overheard part of the conversation between Aunt Valia and grandfather's cousin Stepan. George sometimes communicated with this apple tree like a person. I told him, even when Kristen was alive, that this useless tree needs to be cut down. It has long grown higher than the roof of the house, and apples cannot be easily obtained. Kristen, Kingdom of Heaven. She kept swearing that this tree was of little use. It would bear fruit for a year so that you were tired of growing the harvest. Then it wouldn't bear a single fruit. Everything was threatened to be cut down. Only George, blessed to his memory, always stood up to defend the apple tree, nodding, and Julia agreed with the interlocutor. What you say is true. George's passion for this old apple tree also seemed strange to me. Well, if only the plot was about a hectare, then it would seem that the place wouldn't be a problem. But it's simply stupid to leave such a huge tree in such a small snippet of conversation, made Helen think. Indeed, in fact, grandfather treated this apple tree as if it were a living person. The girl often saw him affectionately stroking the bark of a tree as he passed by. Once as a child, Helen, deciding to play, climbed onto a branch, which broke off under her. And grandfather George, entrusting his granddaughter to the care of his wife, began to treat the wound of the tree himself, recently. After the death of grandmother Kristen, my grandfather even preferred to relax alone under the crown of an apple tree, rather than in a specially built gazebo entwined with grapes. Thoughts from the mysterious apple tree that George had so highlighted briefly receded to sad worries. The relatives were the last to leave the rented hall, and Stepan reminded Helen, no, someone should definitely spend the night in George's house until 40. You won't be scared alone until your parents show up. Maybe send someone with you. At least take Mylena, my youngest daughter, with you. She has nothing to do at home anyway. Her husband is on a business trip. You can sit and chat. Looking at her, she saw the face of a woman who clearly had her own plans for the evening and completely lacked the desire to spend the night somewhere in an unfamiliar place. Helen hastened to refuse. But thank you, but I really can handle it myself. After all, it's like a sign of my respect for my grandfather. Having said goodbye to everyone, the girl hurried to the public transport stop, since her relatives had to go in completely different directions. As soon as Helen opened the gate of her grandfather's house, she regretted that she had tried to create the image of an independent and strong person. Of course, she's not too young to be afraid of an empty house. But I've already spent several nights here completely alone, so he can handle it. She began to think again about the reason why the tree occupied such an important place in the life of her relative. Thoughtfully, the girl hand-fed the sad cat, but she felt somehow uneasy being in the house, even in the company of a cat. Helen went out into the yard and, obeying an impulse, approached a tree on which small green fruits were hanging high somewhere. A flock of goosebumps ran down her spine when the girl saw scratches on the ground. There was no doubt. Grandfather George left these marks. It became truly creepy when Helen had the crazy idea that the dying man was scratching the ground not in agony but trying to dig something up. The girl went to the barn, took a small garden trowel from there, and returning to the apple tree, began to carefully dig the ground. Almost immediately, the scoop hit something hard. Helen began to dig with the utmost care and soon pulled out from a shallow hole a solid rectangular package, wrapped in a bag and additionally wrapped with tape. Helen had never heard any stories about family heirlooms and was truly shocked. At home, Helen laid an old towel on the table, which had long been asking for a well-deserved rest somewhere in the trash, put her find on it, and carefully opened the package with a kitchen knife, which grandfather always kept sharp. Under the layers of tape in the bag was a metal candy box. The girl, holding her breath, opened it and saw inside not jewelry or money but papers under the folded notebook leaves. Clearly covered with grandmother's even handwriting, there were envelopes. Judging by the fact that the package was quite modern, with the emblem of a chain supermarket, and the paper was neither damp nor yellowed, Helen concluded that the find had not lain in the ground for very long, thinking that nothing bad would happen if she found out what her grandfather was trying to get before his death. Helen began to study the find. It was clearly written by my grandmother. "My dear George, I'm writing you a note, realizing that I have very little time left in this world, and I don't think I have the right to take this secret with me. Forgive me, George, for many years ago, because of love for you, I committed deception and even a crime. It's hard to admit, but it's necessary. You and I were already married then. They sent my daughter to kindergarten, and I returned to work at the post office. Everything was fine with us, so I envied myself. And then I saw a letter addressed to you. The sender was a certain woman. My heart immediately felt bad. I didn't give you the letter. I secretly read it myself. That's how I found out about your novel. Your sweetheart reported that it was her strict father who arranged your separation back in 1964. He threatened to kill you or put you in jail using his connections. In fact, he left her the only way, to tell you, looking into your eyes, that he doesn't love you at all and doesn't want to see you ever again. The mother tried to stand up for her daughter, but it did not help. The woman was simply beaten by her own husband because she dared to say a word in defiance. I looked at what your father had done and was terribly afraid for you. That's why she said convincingly everything she was told. After this cruel confession, you predictably flared up, packed your things, took an apple tree seedling as a souvenir for your parents and returned. The sensible woman in the letter reported that she was pregnant with your child, and to cover up her sin, she was married off without an official signature to some widower with numerous children in a remote settlement that didn't even have a name. I read the letter in the dark, wet with tears, and even began to sympathize with your young beloved. She complained that her family life did not work out. The man with whom she had to live perceived her as a servant, but despite the scandals with relatives, Alina named the girl she was born your daughter in honor of her mother Sophie. The unfortunate young mother found herself literally in slavery. She endured beatings, humiliation, and tirelessly planned her escape. When my daughter began to grow up, Alien became even heavier. The native children of this so-called husband began to mock the girl, and her mother could not say a word in defense. The beatings began immediately. Only 5 years later, Alien still managed to escape from her husband. She did not give details, but because even the letters at this point were blurred from tears spilled on the paper, it was clear it was very difficult. Alien asked that you come to these very settlements for her and her daughter. She wrote that she would be waiting for you. When I read the letter, it was as if I had gone blind and deaf at the same time. I really didn't understand how I should continue to live. Giving you the messages meant losing my family, and our son was only 3 years old. How could I deprive his father with my own hands? How would he grow up without you? I repent. That first letter, I then destroyed it and threw it in the oven. I thought I protected my family. I shouldn't have hoped. Alien continued to send letters. The next one came almost a year later. Apparently, she planned for you to receive news from her and your daughter on your birthday. She asked why you don't answer her. How scared I was then that she would get ready and come to you. The distance is not particularly long, maybe a little more than 300 kilometers or something like that. It turns out that almost next door to us live those who are capable of destroying my life. If I can burn the letters, then the problem with Sophie is more complicated. What am I supposed to do with a woman and child? I started thinking about how I could prevent them from coming to you. I wrote a letter copying your handwriting on your behalf just in case. I promised that I would come as soon as I could. You probably don't even remember how I tried to persuade you to move, but you never agreed. So I lived like on a volcano. I didn't know how to protect my happiness, how to preserve it if you found out the truth about yours. At work, I also didn't take any vacation or sick leave because of this. Then you realized, 5 years later, that only once a year does this woman bother you. I felt a little better. I burned the letters for a long time, several years, and then I felt ashamed. I started hiding them. I knew that there were places in the house that you would never think of getting into. The only thing is, because of my own fears, I couldn't leave my post office and refuse the more promising position. Well, it's okay, I'm used to it. How long did she write to you? But I only saved 10 messages with the last letter that arrived in 1994, and I acted completely meanly, and that she wrote that her health had become completely bad and that she needed medication. And although Sophie tries to support her, there's always not enough money. It's clear. It was such a time then, the whole country was in a fever. She didn't ask for anything for herself. But, of course, I couldn't completely calm down. What if the difficult one brings her to our region? What if she decides to see you? I carefully printed this envelope and returned it with the note the addressee has left. After that, the stream of letters from Alien completely dried up. Why should I have done this before? And I don't understand it myself. There wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And now I don't know what to do with the letters. By right and conscience, you should read them, but not during my lifetime. So, when you find out the bitter story of Ali and your daughter, I will no longer be there. Sorry for being selfish, but I couldn't do otherwise. She loved you too much and didn't want to leave her son without a father. Now I don't care anymore. Gina has also grown up a long time ago, and his granddaughter is a bride. So the path to Alien is clear. I only ask you one thing. Wait at least a year after I leave before looking for your first love and daughter, whom you have never seen. Maintain this period of mourning in honor of all the good things that happened between us. And then do as your heart tells you. Forgive me for everything. Loving you, Kristen. Helen was shocked when she read the note. The story of tragic love, many years of deception, and difficult confession involuntarily touched her. The girl thought that probably Kristen's grandmother should have kept her secret forever. On the other hand, she understood that this was too cowardly. Of course, it's easier to judge from the outside than to find yourself in such a stalemate. And Helen couldn't imagine what she would have done in her grandmother's place. Would you immediately tell your legal husband that his friend still loves him and is waiting for him, together with their common daughter, or would you try by any means within your imagination to protect him from this literally stunning information? It became clear to Helen what Grandpa George wanted to talk to her about. Surely, since the 1-year reprieve that Grandmother Kristen asked him for was coming to an end, he wanted to get advice on how to find his old lover. After all, a lot of time has passed, and it is possible that this alien has long since changed the common surname Smith. Her daughter, Helen's blood sister and her father's daughter, could also probably be married. Trying to distract myself from the unexpected information received, Helen put the papers back into the box, put it in the closet, and began reading the letters that Alien had sent to her grandfather. You never know what other details of the personal life of a loved one will be revealed. So alone, except for the cat, she fell into a light sleep. It was boring, and Helen started cleaning, although there was no particular need for this. The girl took out a bucket of dirty water to throw it into the far corner of the site and saw a car drive up to the gate. Helen's parents, who had finally returned from abroad, got out of the car, and she was incredibly happy. Even though this meeting was tinged with bitterness, at least the worry for the parents receded from the heart. During the confused conversation, it turned out that they had arrived in a place where there was no connection or access to the internet. Michael and Anne, having reached civilization, received a sad message from their daughter just before the funeral of grandfather George and hurried to return, but were still late. Helen was glad that she now had the support she needed so much. After hugs and tears, when everyone was already sitting at the table, the girl began to tell her dad and mom about the unusual find. To prove her words, the girl took out a box from the closet and together with her parents. She once again read aloud Grandma Kristen's handwritten confession, and then they studied the surviving letters. One of them contained a photo from a photo studio. It depicted two pretty girls, and there was clearly a kinship in the appearance of the beauties, but they looked more like sisters with a not very big age difference. However, the inscription on the back of the photograph indicated that this was the first love of grandfather George and their common daughter Sophie. In beautiful handwriting it was written, "In memory of my beloved George from Alien and Sophie on her 16th birthday. We look forward to meeting you. 1981. Michael, forgetting about his respectability, even whistled, "Yes." To say that I'm surprised is to say nothing at all. How did Mom manage to keep all this a secret for so many years and not give away her knowledge? I can't even imagine. Anne, who had a wonderful relationship with her calm mother-in-law, contrary to all stereotypes and ideas about the peculiarities of the family way of life, was also perplexed. They had so many heart-to-heart conversations, but Kristen never said a word that somewhere far away her official husband had a beloved and illegitimate daughter. It was not easy to come to terms with such news. Anne asked, "Do you think we should find your sister and her mother, if she's still alive, of course, or let everything remain as it is?" The man himself did not know how to react to what was happening. Judging by what he learned from his daughter, the father wanted the secret of his youth to be known. On the other hand, is it ethical now to intrude into the fate of a stranger, but a woman related by blood? She appears to be about 50 years old now, and this same alien is most likely now approaching 70. A reminder of her difficult youth and the man she once loved so much but never got to see could be harmful to her health. In addition, as Kristen's grandmother wrote, after she sent back the letter marked the addressee has dropped out, they stopped coming at all. This could mean that Alien believed the lie or that she was desperate. However, alas, the most unfavorable events in the fate of the woman and her daughter could have happened, Bryn said, as if voicing her thoughts out loud. But still, it seems to me that we should at least try to find my grandfather's daughter just to somehow rehabilitate him. After all, it's not Grandpa George's fault that everything turned out this way. I think it would be fair if the whole truth became known to Alien, and of course Sophie. Listen, Dad. The girl turned to Michael. How do you feel knowing that you have an older blood sister? Do you want to see her and chat? The man was confused and asked his daughter in response. And you, Helen, this is Sophie. Actually, Auntie, that's what you have to do. It turns out that it's interesting to meet her. Helen listened to herself and admitted, curious and a little scary. Opinions in the family were divided. Anne, after listening to her husband and daughter, said, "It seems to me that we should leave everything as it is. There is no need now to disturb something that has long been forgotten. More than half a century has passed. Maybe this alien is happy with another person. And hello, meet, so to speak, relatives." I think this is not entirely correct. A long conversation did not help find a compromise. In addition, all family members themselves were not sure of the correctness of their thoughts. As a result, the father went to bed in order to visit the place of George's final resting place in the morning. "Sorry, Dad, I'm late," Michael whispered, standing by a fresh mound covered with wreaths. "I never could have imagined that we wouldn't see each other again." The man put 4 scarlet carnations on the empty space and bowed his head, hiding his tears. After Michael, flowers were laid on George's grave by his daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Each of the grieving relatives realized that they were subconsciously waiting for a sign on how to deal with the information that had fallen on them. They didn't talk about it out loud, but Michael, Anne, and Helen were waiting for a revelation to descend on them. Perhaps it was naive and stupid, but I would really like to know what George himself wanted. No matter how much they hoped for a clue, they could not get it, and with a heavy heart they returned to the apartment. We decided that Michael would live in the house for now, and that his wife and daughter would come to him in their free time. While Anne helped her husband pack at least the minimum necessary things, Helen hurried to the nearest store to buy some special food that was tastier for the yearning cat. The girl felt very sorry for the cat, who seemed to have suddenly lost his luster and lost his previously excellent appetite. After consulting with a serious-looking woman who was busily putting bags of wet food into the cart, Helen collected some gifts for her grandfather's pet and returned home, handing her dad a bag of food. "My dear, I'll ask. He is now a little capricious and may refuse food. Try to feed him from the palm of your hand. He usually starts eating as a sign of respect." And Tuis smiled at his daughter. "No, don't worry. I won't offend the tailed one. The days flew by. Just keep up with them." Helen, her mother, went to work, and in the evenings they talked about everything, as the girls were accustomed to from early childhood. Of course, they also talked about the secret that Grandma Kristen had been hiding for. We decided to gather our relatives. We sat together mentally, remembering various incidents from the past. Michael carefully tried to beg it from his great-uncle. "Stephen, can you tell us anything about Dad's youth?" The older man was happy to talk. George was always brave for any good cause, responsive and decisive. When he returned from the army, he went to the factory to get a job in the personnel department. As his mother later said, he heard from someone that young people from our city were sent to build villages and do household work. It was no longer a new thing then. Everyone in the country wanted to help. The people acted in unison. So George, after returning from military service, decided that he would be more useful there. I admit, I also wanted to go with him, but where should I go? In total at that time, I was 15 years old. George is 5 years older than me. In general, he went far. Fortunately, in the Army, he learned to drive a truck and received a license. He returned almost 5 years later. I brought saplings, as if as a souvenir of my long business trip. Of course, he has changed during this time. A naive boy left, but an almost grown man returned. Not because I'm related, but to be fair, I'll say that George definitely hasn't become any worse. I think she can find such Sophie now. His hands are golden and his character is worthy. When here at the automobile plant, they accepted him with open arms. Teetotal, hardworking, honest. What more could you ask for? Hungry for work, and so he will take off his last shirt and give it to someone else. Oh, and the men respected him. No matter what, he never refused. Well, women generally died for him, and he treated everyone very respectfully. Then he married Kristen. She worked at the post office, and somehow the company car broke down, and George was driving by and couldn't leave his fellow driver in trouble. That's how we met. We met briefly and signed, and see, my mother was even offended. It seemed like the holiday was squeezed. But since you, Gina, were born, George was happy. Here in the yard, relatives, neighbors, and colleagues staged a big party. Everyone was invited. It seemed like there weren't any delicacies on the table, but come on, that's not the main thing. It turns out that the atmosphere is much more important. Yes, there was a time when all the neighbors lived almost like relatives. Stefan Alexandrovich interrupted his memories to quench his thirst with a cool, tasty compote. And although he didn't manage to learn anything new that his son didn't know, it was still nice to hear kind words addressed to George. After only Michael, Anne, and Helen remained in the house, the female part of the family cleaned up, leaving the only man, apart from the cat, to dismantle the makeshift benches. Helen went to bed on her favorite cot, and she had a strange, incredibly realistic dream. The girl was not even afraid when she saw Grandfather George at his favorite apple tree. The man stood under the tree, gently stroking the bark and looking at his granddaughter, asking, "When the apples ripen, take a few and give them to those you know. Don't forget, Helen. Please don't forget." Grandfather George looked somewhere, of his trying to see what was happening behind his granddaughter's shoulder. Helen turned to see what or who interested the man, but it was empty. When the girl's gaze returned to the apple tree, Grandfather was no longer under the canopy. Outside the window, birds whistled and sang, tearing Helen out of the captivity of sleep, which left behind a vivid impression. There were no doubts left. Grandfather George conveyed the news, the very sign that was so missing to make the right decision. Of course, he made his desire clear. At his request, Kristen and Helen must go on a trip in the fall so that her grandfather's longtime beloved and their common daughter will find out the whole truth. Shocked, Helen did not hide from her parents that she saw Grandfather George in a dream. Michael was even a little annoyed that the late father in his dreams visited not him, but his granddaughter. But wise Anne supported both her husband and daughter, so it was necessary. There, beyond reality, there are probably its own rules. In anticipation of the holiday, the whole family began preparing for Helen's upcoming trip. The girls' attempts to find Enya and Sophie on social networks were unsuccessful, although she patiently looked through hundreds of pages of users from various regions, and not just from that area. Helen planned to hit the road on the first day of her vacation, so as not to delay the resolution of the issue, which had already been postponed for many years by the will of Kristen's grandmother. The girls' parents, trying not to show their excitement, helped their daughter get ready. They reacted most responsibly to the upcoming transportation of apples, which grandfather ordered to take with and placed a rectangular basket without a handle in a rather compact but roomy sports bag. She carefully placed the ripe fruits there, laying each layer with parchment paper on her husband's advice, and the main load, carefully covered with a towel, was packed. Helen added the minimum amount of things to her bag and hit the road. At the girl's request, her parents only accompanied her to the taxi, and although the daughter promised to call and report the results of the search, Anne and Michael were worried about their daughter. It is not at all a fact that the search expedition will be successful, and a meeting with a woman from George Ilyach's past could lead to completely unpredictable results. Thanks to a carefully thought-out route and the absence of any unforeseen circumstances, Helen easily reached the village from where grandfather George had been receiving letters for so long, some of which he was able to read only after his wife's death. The local villages seemed to the girl to be quite a cozy settlement. The coming autumn had already touched the trees with gold and made the village especially picturesque. Private houses coexisted peacefully with apartment buildings, near which in some places there were small vegetable gardens and even greenhouses. The girl approached the house, the address of which was indicated on the envelope. An intercom was installed on the entrance door of a typical 5-story building, and Helen froze for a few seconds in indecision. She, although she was preparing mentally for the trip and even diligently prepared a short speech before the difficult explanation, suddenly became scared. Having overcome herself, Helen typed the number of the apartment she was interested in on the keyboard. Hearing a pleasant female voice from the speakers of the device, the girl asked, "May he shucked? Hello, excuse me, please. Can I talk to Alien and her daughter Sophie? Come in." It came from the speaker, and the door opened. Helen was very surprised that the stranger, whose voice sounded from the speakers, did not ask her either her name or the purpose of meeting her. But there was no time to think. Breathing deeply to calm down, the girl went up to the second floor she needed, where a not-quite-old woman was already waiting for her behind the open door. Helen peered into her face, but in vain. I tried to recognize the stranger Sophie. How, given the fact that in the photograph she was captured at the height of her young 16 years and more than 3 decades had passed, it was unlikely that such drastic changes could have occurred. Outwardly, the woman was of a completely different type, and she looked at most about 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Is it possible to accurately determine age by the appearance of modern women who take care of themselves, to which the stranger undoubtedly belonged? Helen greeted warmly. "Hello again. I was the one who bothered you. Tell me, please, how can I talk to Alien and Sophie?" The woman conducted the conversation freely, even in a brotherly way, as if she had known Helen for many years. Hello, if you're not joking. From what regions did you come? The question surprised Helen, but she answered honestly, although she did not understand why it mattered. The woman, hearing the name of the city, softened and invited her to enter the apartment, where she asked another strange question. "What are your grandfather's last names?" "My grandfather's last name on my father's side is Johnson, and on my mother's side, Adrian." The uttered phrase had a strange effect on the woman. She didn't ask any more questions. She began to fuss. Despite Helen's excuses, she led her into the kitchen through her plate of delicious rosy pies. She offered tea, coffee, homemade compote, and, holding out a glass of sweet drink to the guests, my mom's best friend was Sophie. She was like a caring nanny and an older sister to me. They survived together even when there was nothing special to eat except potatoes grown in a vacant lot. Meat was seen occasionally. Alien, as she was planting, was so worried and afraid, and she hoped that one day they would look for her. I firmly told my mother not to tell anyone how to find her and her daughter, except for the man with the last name Johnson or his descendants. She was deeply in love with a certain George Johnson. The daughter is the fruit of their sinful and sweet love. Yes, that's right, George Johnson, my grandfather. Helen confirmed her comment. He passed away recently. Only after this did it become clear that his first love and their common daughter once lived here in your apartment at this very address. It's not Grandpa George's fault that he didn't find them earlier. This is how the circumstances developed. The landlady took a notebook from the closet, tore out a piece of paper, took a pen and flipped through the pages. I began to rewrite something, not forgetting to show cordiality. You eat, drink. Perhaps you rushed here straight from the station. Refresh yourself. Otherwise, in order to meet alien or daughter to meet again on the road, you will have to go to another city. They moved. We had to, although it was incredibly difficult for us to part. They became almost family. But after Aunt Alien encountered an acquaintance of the man who kept her as a slave, she was afraid to stay here. It's easier to get lost in a big city. Here you go. I texted you their address and Sophie's phone number to arrange a meeting. Knowing Aunt Alien, I am sure that she is still waiting for news about her beloved. But it's better if you and Sophie discuss the time and place of the meeting. Things aren't going well in their house. My daughter got an extremely nasty husband. When I saw him for the first time, can you imagine? I was even scared. It seems like a person is standing, smiling at you, and his eyes are contemptuous and angry. As my aunt later told me, he helped my daughter a lot in some way when she got a new job in the city, and she fell in love without noticing any of his shortcomings. When I saw it, it was too late, like a fly caught in a web. No matter how hard his aunt tries to get him away from his daughter, it just doesn't work. Lessons, the woman fell silent. Apparently, she herself was worried about this situation, but she did not know how to help the woman whom she considered practically her sister. Helen tried not to look like she was from a hungry region, but she was also unable to refuse the tasty treat and belatedly remembered the rules of etiquette. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Helen. My name is. Thank you very much. Your pies are very tasty and the compote is simply wonderful. The woman was very cutely embarrassed. Me, come on. It's me who attacked with interrogation. My name is Alice. By the way, an alien taught me to cook. She is generally a master at cooking. Listen, Helen, do you have money for the trip? A taxi will cost more, but it will be faster than taking a train. Sorry, it's not much, but I can give you $50. Helen was deeply shocked by this proposal. Some Alice seems to be a completely modern young woman in her simple-minded and open behavior like good characters from old films that grandparents loved to watch. Such a friendly attitude brought tears to Helen's eyes, and she hastened to calm Alice down. Don't worry, my finances are fine. Thank you, Alice. I'm very glad to meet you. Thank you for the treat. It's time to move on. Helen looked at the cost of a taxi to her destination in the app and sighed. Yes, you're right. The price tag is something incredible. It doesn't matter. I'd love to take a ride on the train. Alice didn't let her guess go so easily. Mate. Now we'll look at the schedule of electric trains and passing trains on the internet. Maybe we'll even book a ticket right away. Why are you toiling around in the waiting room in vain? It's better to keep me company here. It's true. Helen nodded, agreeing with Alice's wisdom. But the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. It turned out that given the time it takes to get to the station, you almost have to say goodbye to the hospitable woman. Almost leaving the apartment, Helen hesitated for a while. Opening the bag, she took out several large fragrant apples and handed them to Alice. Here, these are apples from my grandfather's orchard. They are very tasty. I don't know how else to thank you for such a warm welcome. Alice was embarrassed again, but accepted the apples. I can't resist such an incredible aroma and beauty. They are just like the picture. Say hi to Sophie. By the way, I'll probably, with your permission, warn her that you're going to see them. Let her somehow prepare an Oya. Otherwise, you never know, the blood pressure will jump, the heart will catch, or something else. Helen had no objections, and having said a warm goodbye to her new friend, the girl went to the station. Already with the sound of wheels, she sent her parents a detailed story about how the responsive Alice greeted her. She said that Alien and Sophie had moved, but she had their new address. The mother, who was clearly worried about her daughter, responded almost instantly and asked her to be careful on the road. The girl with a light heart promised to look around carefully and not get involved in any dubious adventures. Fortunately, the situation in the carriage was quite calm. Someone peered thoughtfully at the landscape outside the window, becoming less and less visible due to the approaching darkness. Some of the random fellow passengers were dozing, and Helen regretted that she could not like most passengers in the carriage, immerse herself in communication with a smartphone. The charge level forced me to refrain from this luxury. Almost at the moment when the previous day crossed the border of night to remain forever in the past, Helen found herself in an ancient town standing on the girl thought with belated regret that she had not thought to book a hotel room in advance, because showing up at a stranger's apartment at such a late time was somehow completely awkward. The girl felt a little uneasy, but ordering herself not to be a coward, she quickly figured out how to get to the nearest hotel before her smartphone was completely discharged. Luck was with Helen. The administrator, smiling, even seemed to sincerely offer a small, but in her words, a very cozy room. Soon Helen settled into her temporary housing and, having put her smartphone on charge, took a shower, had dinner, and lay down on the... Although it was late, the mattress was comfortable, no loud sounds penetrated the hotel room, and there was no sleep in either eye. Still, there is a meeting in the morning, for which she went on a trip, and the anxiety appeared again. The girl was thinking for the 100th time about what to say to the innocent victim of deception and how to apologize for her grandmother, and in general, in what style to conduct the conversation. After all, if, with the good-natured Alice, everything somehow turned out very naturally, this does not mean that communication with Ale and Sophie will be just as pleasant. Although she managed to fall asleep only in the morning, Helen woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock, thanks to the girl's youth. The anxious night did not leave any noticeable marks on her appearance, and at 10, she decided to call Sophie. The woman answered almost instantly. It seemed as if she was expecting this call. It is quite likely that this was the case. After all, it's not very often that there are such meetings of relatives who had no idea about each other. Having quickly agreed to meet in one of the cafes located near the hotel, Sophie was the first to end the conversation. Surprisingly, the choice of a neutral public place for the meeting finally calmed Helen, for whom her recent acquaintance with Alice made the most pleasant and even encouraging impression. Well, such a sweet, kind woman simply cannot be friends and consider bad Sophie her family. This means that they are at least quite adequate. In addition, in a cafe surrounded by Sophie, she is unlikely to reach a violent expression of emotions, and there is less risk that Alien will get too nervous. The girl transferred the basket of apples into a spacious shopping bag, which she had prudently taken with her, and went to the meeting. As Helen approached the cafe, she noticed a slender woman on the porch of the establishment, in whose features it was quite possible to see the girl from the photograph from the letter. The girl was the first to say hello and introduce herself. "Hey, hello, Sophie. I'm Helen Johnson. It turns out that my grandfather is your dad," the woman smiled. "Very nice. I tell you quite sincerely, Alice told me that she had wonderful impressions of communication, and her opinion, as life has shown, must be trusted. But let's go. I'll introduce you to Mom, and we'll talk calmly. She's waiting for us inside." The acquaintance procedure turned out to be unusually calm. Alien behaved affably, but with poorly concealed interest, peering into the face of the granddaughter of her beloved man. To somehow break the prolonged silence, Helen handed the woman a bag. "Here, these are apples from your grandfather's orchard." Alien looked up from studying her face and, looking inside the bag, gasped, "No." The woman carefully took out one fruit, looking at it, holding it tenderly, as if the apple were a living creature, and, without addressing either Helen or her daughter, she spoke quietly. It was noticeable that she wanted to express all the accumulated pain. "George and I once dreamed that we would live in a house near which an apple tree would definitely grow. Not just like a fruit tree, but also seemingly in honor of me. What a pity that our dreams did not come true. When we met, I was only 15 years old. However, in my native land, all girls grow up early, mature for family life with a loved one. George was 9 years older. This age difference did not bother me at all. I deceived him. She said that they were already adults, and he couldn't even think that I was lying. We loved each other, forgetting about everything in the world. Probably as punishment for my lies and this sin, higher powers forced me to. Moreover, this terrible punishment also affects my daughter." The woman stroked the hand of her daughter sitting next to her, who blushed like boiled crayfish and fell silent. Helen, listening and without interrupting, "It's not at all that higher powers intervened in your life. Everything is much simpler and more offensive. Grandfather George, I received some of your letters only after the death of my wife, my grandmother." Helen told in detail everything she knew. And not forgetting to mention her strange dream. Someday, mate, so I came here so that you know everything. Both my parents and I thought it would be fair. I'm very sorry that your love had such a tragic story. But now nothing can be fixed. Lillian held an apple in one hand, pressing it to her heart with her palm, and with the other she wiped away the tears that stubbornly rolled down her cheeks. Neither Sophie nor Helen knew what to say or how to calm the woman in this grief. The silence was like an unspoken minute of silence over George's death. They haven't ordered drinks or food yet. Alien, as if waking up from a daze, suggests, "My dears, maybe we can walk along the street. I'm missing some air." Helen and Sophie agreed without hesitation, although the waiter, who did not wait for the order or at least a tip, simply looked unhappy. Nobody cared about him. Three representatives of the fair sex reflected on the vicissitudes of fate and how outside interference destroys the most wonderful dreams. My daughter wanted to take the bag of apples, but Alien stopped her. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to part with these apples." Fortunately, the long handles made it possible to hang the bag on your shoulder, so it wasn't too heavy to carry. Alien asked Helen to tell everything she knew about her grandfather. What kind of work he did, what programs he liked to watch, what he liked to eat, and other everyday little things. The woman seemed to absorb the moments that had passed her by and smiled quietly. Perhaps she imagined that she herself had lived next to him all these years. The almost idyllic walk was interrupted by the ringtone of Sophie's mobile phone. The man who called shouted so loudly that even at a distance of the alley, Helen heard everything he said. "No, why the hell aren't you at home or at work? I was in a hurry on purpose, driving like crazy. And everything is like in a bad joke. Where are you going? Look, if I find out that you're cheating on me, I'll kill everyone, and you and your mother will fly out of my apartment like little kids." Stately Sophie, listening to the tirade, seemed to become smaller in stature. The lights in her eyes went out, and she answered briefly, "I'll be there now." Alien became noticeably agitated. It seems that the voice of the man who called was well known to her, and this man did not evoke the slightest positive emotions in her. Sophie began to say goodbye to Helen and then turned to her mother. "Listen, I'll run. Boris seems to be on edge already, and you can talk some more. You probably would like to talk about a lot of things." She hurried to leave, and from that moment, the casual conversation seemed to evaporate. The girl understood. The woman was terribly afraid for her daughter, who, as it was easy to understand, was in a relationship with a real tyrant. Soon Alien confirmed the guess of her young companion. "I have the impression that my bitter story of slavery and the power of a cruel, domineering man is now being continued by my daughter. She, however, got married, unlike me, quite officially, and even out of great love. That's how it seemed at least 15 years ago. I was so happy for my daughter. Boris always treated me, and even more so her, with respect. But as soon as he managed to persuade me to add my savings to a shared apartment, the relationship began to deteriorate instantly, gradually. One thing didn't suit him, then another. While I was huddled separately in a rented room, separate from my daughter and son-in-law, I had no idea how everything really was. Then, 5 years ago, I became seriously ill and went on long sick leave. In general, I had to ask Boris to come to their 2-room apartment. It seems that I felt that I had the moral right to do this, but, of course, I felt uneasy. Nothing. She hid her pride somewhere far away and asked to stay with her daughter and Boris. Then I saw that not everything was fine with them. There are always some complaints against my daughter, jealousy, hurtful words. In a milder version than before, the monster oppressed me, but every reproach against Sophie was a punishment for me. Recently, he began to accuse me of infertility, although he himself always repeated that children were not included in his life plans. I get the impression that he is provoking Sophie to divorce, and then when we exchange the apartment, we will get some kind of closet. I now clearly understand that Boris will share everything thoroughly down to every spoon, and that she and I are like two blades of grass that can be broken like spitting. I have no legal education. Sophie is also far from this. We cannot afford a good lawyer financially. Helen did not know how to console the unhappy woman who had never in her life been able to lean on a reliable man's shoulder. Instead of rushing into battle with all the troubles yourself, it seems that friendship with Alice's mother is the only bright spot in her life, even if it was not easy. But when no one tries to solve the problems, it is at least morally easier. As soon as I lost my permanent job and started baking at home, the fragile balance collapsed. Somehow everything went downhill. Although the standard of living even seemed to become higher. I can probably pay for my rented apartment again. But here's the irony of fate. I simply began to fear for my daughter's health. How afraid I am that Boris will start raising his hand against Sophie. And now there's something uneasy in my heart, as if some kind of trouble is approaching. Helen, I don't want to involve you in our family squabbles, but come to us, please. With you. Boris should moderate his ambition. He always does this in the presence of strangers, enthusiastically and even selflessly. Plays the role of an exemplary husband. If you ask our neighbors, everyone will probably unanimously say that my Sophie is incredibly lucky to have him. Helen immediately agreed to join us. Soon, after traveling a few bus stops and walking a little along the street, they found themselves inside the apartment. A muffled male voice was heard from one of the rooms. Now I'll teach you how to greet your husband, because in such fools as you need to put the thought into not wagging your tail in the absence of your legal spouse. Alien opened the door and saw Boris grab Sophie by the neck, lifting her off the floor. In a state of some kind of irrational anger, the woman took the bag of apples from her shoulder and hit her son-in-law on the head with it. The man, having let go of his victim, as if knocked down, collapsed on the floor, freezed from coughing. Mom, what are you doing? What fly bit you? What if you broke Borea's skull? Len slowly walked up to the sofa, sat down on it, and asked, Sophie, nothing will happen to Boris. Better bring me some water with a sedative. My heart is starting to pound. Helen, meanwhile, looked closely at the man. He was clearly not too stunned and was already trying to get up. She looked dumbfounded. Boris was in no hurry to get up and, rubbing the back of his head, angrily collapsed on Alien and began to threaten. Don't even think that this will be in vain. I'll go and film the beatings at the emergency room and put you, the senile old woman, behind bars. Sophie's hand shook as she handed the cup of medicine to her mother. The woman began to persuade Boris not to get excited, but he only became more unruly and uttered threats. You'll go and eat gruel until you die, and then you'll die in a government house. And with your health, there's no point in being there. Unexpectedly, Boris's tirade was interrupted by Helen, who unwillingly, along with her grandfather and father, watched a variety of detective series and had, albeit small, but valuable experience in calming down even the most inappropriate office visitors and presumptuous suppliers. First of all, I'll call the police here right now. I saw with my own eyes how you tried to harm Sophie. So Alien's actions may well qualify as causing grievous bodily harm in self-defense, but you may have much more serious problems. Believe me. Helen herself could not understand how she had the audacity to tell an adult man some numbers of articles of the criminal code emerging from the depths of the subconscious. Stress probably took its toll. She used some legal terms so boldly that Boris, under the furious pressure of the stranger, noticeably became shy, and then, carefully getting up, left the room, saying to his wife, You're lucky that I have a strong head, otherwise I would have become a widow. When the man left, Helen sat down on the sofa next to Alien. The woman began to apologize to the guest. Sorry, Helen, that this happened. Low inside the girl was still shaking with anger. She managed to answer almost calmly. There's nothing to apologize for at all. Sophie, standing near the wall, listened to what was happening in the kitchen, where Boris had gone, and then she rushed there, surprising her mother and Helen. The man was busy climbing through the cabinets in a fit of rage. He threw everything out of them right onto the floor, quietly called out to her son-in-law. Boris, calm down. I hid my stash a long time ago. As soon as I noticed that the bills began to gradually disappear from there, you won't find anything in the kitchen, don't hope. The man, not knowing where he was stepping, crushed cereals and pasta, left the kitchen, almost knocked down Sophie, who was in his way, and soon slammed the door loudly. And Sophie began to clean up the consequences of the destruction caused by Boris, and Helen, without thinking for long, joined them. In response to the hostess's objections, the girl admitted, Partly I feel a little guilty for everything that happened, so of course I won't stand aside. The mess in the kitchen was almost eliminated when Boris appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a man in a police uniform. Hello. Boris invited me to look into the circumstances of the beating. Alien sank into a chair, exhausted. Sophie looked angrily at her husband, who, on the contrary, was jubilant. While the women were cleaning up, he made a fuss and literally dragged a law enforcement officer into the apartment, greatly exaggerating the scale of the conflict, naturally, without telling you that before the ill-fated blow to the back of the head, He almost sent his wife to the next world. Helen was amazed at Boris's impudence and blurted out to eliminate the possibility of a dirty trick from this man with a rotten and petty soul. "Excuse me, can I see your ID?" The lieutenant presented the documents and began the interview. While Elena began to talk about what happened, Helen asked permission to call. The policeman did not interfere, and the girl hurried to dial her father's number. Michael listened to his daughter without interrupting, and then said, "In general, Victor will call you back now. He is well versed in such matters. You put the phone on speakerphone, and I think he will be able to resolve this situation favorably and without unnecessary hassle." Helen's father was not mistaken. Boris's triumphant appearance melted as, during a telephone conversation, the policeman, seeing red prints on Sophie's neck, began to cast disapproving glances at the impudent man. The lawyer insisted that the lieutenant also accept a statement from the woman who had been attacked by her husband. And this speech had a wonderful effect. After the mutually amiable completion of telephone conversations, the man sternly asked Boris, "Are you still saying that your wife's mother hit you with a heavy bag for no reason at all?" The picture of this incident is completely different. You, Boris, practically made a false call and even lied. This case, unfortunately, is not subject to jurisdiction, but it is quite possible to run into a fine. Now I will write everything down as it happened and warn you right away. You don't need to deceive me anymore. When Alien showed her terrible remedy, which she applied to her son-in-law, the policeman could hardly contain his smile and involuntarily admired the large, elegant apples. Boris, having read and signed the document drawn up, showered curses and abuse on his wife, her mother, and their young intercessor who had come from nowhere. The district police officer reprimanded the man, and he left the apartment in a rage. The policeman, turning to Sophie, said, "I will advise you simply as a human being. Do not tolerate such an attitude. Further, as experience shows, similar marriages do not lead to anything good. It's not too late to get a divorce." Sophie thanked the district police officer. "Thank you for your informal approach. We handled the situation fairly." Alien put almost half of the apples Helen had brought in a bag to the district police officer and handed it over with the words, "Please accept it as a token of gratitude. I am very embarrassed that my intemperance caused my son-in-law to disturb you." The district police officer shrugged his shoulders, saying that's the job. And then, as if having thrown off the plaque, he formally asked with admiration in his voice, "How did you manage to grow such beautiful apples? At my parents' dacha this year, almost the entire harvest was destroyed by hail at the ovary stage. What was not beaten rotted during the frost." Alien smiled. "I myself didn't expect to admire such apples. This is a famous variety. The defender generously brought these apples to us from another region, where a seedling was delivered many years ago from a southern country by a very good person, despite the difference in climate. The tree has taken root." The police officer thanked him again for the apples, dictated his phone number just in case, and saying goodbye, left the apartment. Despite the successful solution to the problem, Boris's petty revenge in the form of calling the police turned out to be a rather exhausting event for everyone, Bale jokingly stating, "That's it, we've had enough cleaning for today. Where has this been seen? A girl came to visit us, and we gave her a broom and dustpan. That's it, girls, let's set the table in my room. With this hoard, we will be completely starved." Helen was removed from preparing for the feast, and she hurried to call her dad to report that the conversation with the lawyer had helped her get out of a very difficult situation. Michael and Anne, who knew a noticeably softened version of events from her husband, were relieved when their daughter reported this information. Still, even at 24 years old, Helen remained for her parents the same beloved little girl whom they wanted to protect, to cover with their care like a dome, impenetrable to all kinds of evil. As Alice said, Anna turned out to be an incredibly skilled craftswoman when it comes to food. Helen enjoyed trying the seemingly simple but extremely tasty bassifaye. After tea with delicious and homemade sweets, Sophie asked her guest, "Can we arrange a video conference on Skype with your dad? I would like to get to know my half-brother at least in this remote way." Helen admitted, "My parents also asked me about this, but I didn't know how to offer it." "Is it convenient?" Alien threw out her hands. His daughter, "My clever girl, what a good idea you came up with. Come on quickly, set everything up." Just a few minutes later, an image of Michael appeared on the laptop screen. First of all, the man began to ask Alien for forgiveness. It's difficult for me to talk about this, but the happiness of my parents' family and my, in fact, carefree childhood were actually built on the foundation of your misfortunes. Most likely, if letters from you had fallen into the hands of your father earlier, he would probably have found a way to help you. However, my mother was most likely afraid that he would give up everything and ask for a divorce. And he will go to you and his daughter, whom he never had the chance to meet. I sincerely apologize to you, Sophie. I want you to know that you can always count on me. Helen will leave you my phone number and other contacts. Contact us anytime you need it. Helen sat with the hospitable hostesses until the evening, listening and talking about herself and her family. Despite the rather strange circumstances of meeting, no one felt the slightest awkwardness. I didn't even think that I would suddenly have such a wonderful niece. Alien, named Sophie for Helen, saw in her a subtle, almost imperceptible resemblance to George. Similar facial features, dimples, the funny habit of wrinkling your nose and frowning when you smile. For so many years, the woman remembered the only man she loved desperately, and then, as if out of habit, she hoped to meet. And now there is no more chance to see each other. It was incredibly sad, and there was only one consolation. George did not forget her and did not betray her. I naively believed what she said then. That's the only thing she could reproach him for, even if she wanted to. Countless times, Alien imagined that she had handled that fateful conversation differently. If only then, more than half a century ago, she had only found the courage to tell her beloved that her father was threatening to kill him if she had offered to run away. However, George would probably have found a more correct way to solve the problem. If only she had honestly told him everything many years ago. Most likely they would now be together as they dreamed. Maybe for Sophie, who would have felt the care and support of her father in her personal life, everything would have turned out much more successfully. Everything would have been much better. And she would not have gotten involved with this slippery, nasty Boris. They incredibly regretted that she was unable to protect her fragile love. But she couldn't blame the woman who became George's legal wife for this. In the end, it was she, even under pressure, who rejected her loved one. This means there is no point in looking for someone to blame on the side. The day turned out to be long, eventful, and after a hearty meal and long conversations, those sitting at the table began to yawn, either one by one or all at the same time. Helen flatly refused to be escorted to the hotel. "Don't worry, please. The taxi will take me directly to the place, so there will be no difficulties. As soon as I'm in my room, I'll let you know right away." Sophie said goodbye to Helen as a close relative, with whom they share not only blood ties but also friendship, before getting into taxi. The girl waved to her new acquaintances for a long time, looking out of the window, and did not notice how Boris, who was holding a grudge, was approaching her from a bench installed at the next entrance. The man believed that it was this strange young upstart, whom he saw today, for the first time in his life, who was to blame for the unsuccessful day. Just think, he grabbed it lightly, but it hurt her why she left the house and didn't even think to inform him. It is clear that the matter is unclean. He, as a husband, had every right to teach her how a decent woman should behave. And this little girl, instead of apologizing, began to argue with him, explaining that she had not done anything wrong, so he cut off her oxygen, a little to discourage her. And then, as luck would have it, the evil fury came at the wrong time and hit him on the head with all. Boris touched the back of his head, feeling a painful lump, and continued to think about the insult that he had to endure. Surely everything would not have turned out at all joyfully for the wife and her foolish mother, if not for an unfamiliar face. The devil dared her to end up in their apartment today. The man was sure that without the support of this educated trash, women would not have dared to blather in his direction. Moreover, he would have been able, most likely would have been able to convince the district police officer that the women were conspiring against him. But this young sheep turned out to have a trump card after the intervention of an obviously competent lawyer who knew all the laws. He, Boris, had to leave the apartment as a beggar, although he also has the right to square meters. However, the battle for them is still ahead. In the meantime, we need to deal with these insolent women. Of course, he's now breaking in on his wife and her mother. It's no use. They were probably locked with all the locks and a chain. But to lie in wait and teach a lesson, that would be right. It was for this reason that Boris sat on the bench, sort of like a predator in ambush, waiting for Sophie to see when the defenseless sheep leaves the herd and finds itself in his power. The man even laughed and was glad that he had found such a comparison. But the wait dragged on. The autumn evening, gentle and merciless, had already begun to hint that the planned hunt would not take place. Boris was trembling, either from suppressed rage or from hunger and cold, and was about to leave. But then the entrance door opened and a girl jumped out into the street. Boris's joy was somewhat premature because the impudent sheep climbed into the taxi. But this only provoked the man. The chase is the chase. Luckily, the cars are nearby. In the meantime, heavy traffic in the city will not allow the future victim to disappear from view. Helen had already grabbed the door handle to the hotel, dreaming of quickly collapsing on the bed and getting some sleep. But she heard a voice behind her. The girl automatically turned around and lost precious fractions of a second. Boris, whose voice she recognized very well, was rapidly approaching her. Helen turned away and, trying to quickly get into the hotel, out of fear began to push the doors in the wrong direction. When finally salvation was close, the man grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and began to threaten her in a falsely affectionate tone. "Where were you in such a hurry? Explain to me, why the hell are you interfering in my family life? Why are you silent sheep? Who asked you to intervene?" The girl prepared to scream loudly and wondered how to free herself. But I didn't have to look for salvation on my own. She could not see how a district police officer, who was already in civilian clothes, appeared from the slightly open door behind her, but she was incredibly happy when she heard, "Boris, you are completely wrong now. Let the girl go." There were steely notes in the policeman's voice, and Boris instantly loosened his grip and made excuses to the district police officer. "I just came to talk." Then I thought of inviting him for a walk and showing him the city. The policeman, leaving the hotel, asked, "Helen, if you don't mind, wait for me in the foyer. I need to agree on something with Boris." Helen sat down in a comfortable chair. A few minutes later, a local police officer sat down next to him and admitted, I actually came to see you. My parents immediately lost peace when they saw the apples. They asked me to come to an agreement with you about the cuttings. His father wants to vaccinate him and try to grow such beauty too. And I can't count how many times the markets have cheated with varieties. The picture shows one thing, but what emerges is something completely different. So I came here to the hotel. And as it turns out, it's not in vain. The girl smiled. She liked this young and somehow very correct and principled policeman. In gratitude for her salvation, she promised him to send as many Sherenkov as she wanted when she got to her grandfather 2 houses away. They exchanged contacts and said goodbye. The man did not want to part with the charming girl, but he could no longer find any reason to stay close to her. It seems that it was not in vain that Grandfather George sent me to look for Sophie in my dreams. He also advised me to take apples with me. Events after meeting the relatives began to develop with frightening speed. Sophie divorced Boris, and after exchanging the apartment, they moved at the invitation of Michael to his father's house. The man suggested from the bottom of his heart, "Since I am aware of my mother's guilt, let this house be at least a small compensation for all your suffering," and sat for a long time by the apple tree, carefully grown by his loved one, stroking it like a living creature. And Helen, who was always a welcome guest, was glad that the elderly woman, although belatedly, had found peace. In the personal life of the granddaughter, the glossy fruits of the airport also played an important role. Correspondence and regular telephone conversations with Sergio, that policeman, helped to find out that their sympathy is mutual and does not weaken over time, but even becomes stronger. Soon the lieutenant moved to the city to live with his girlfriend, explaining, "Well, our police required everywhere, and if necessary, I can master another profession." Sophie also found her personal happiness when she met a man in a new city. Anna, stroking the apple tree, quietly whispered, "Thank you, George. I know for sure that it was you who helped arrange everything so successfully." Mary stood by the side of the highway and shivered. October was getting colder. She should get a warmer jacket from the pantry. Grandma Veronica had warned her granddaughter yesterday, "Don't be lazy, prepare tomorrow's clothes, according to the weather." But Mary had no time. She finished her homework, then watched a TV series, then with her friends in the yard on the bench chatted until late in the evening. And then it's time to go to bed. Nothing. Tomorrow is Saturday. She will have time to find a warm jacket and clean it, if necessary. The girl didn't like that down jacket. She'd inherited it from her neighbor's daughter, Kristen. She was a grown woman, studying in the city, at university. And the jacket Kristen had worn when she was Mary's age was in good condition, of course, but not fashionable at all. But there was no choice here. Grandma Veronica didn't have that much money to buy her granddaughter fancy new clothes every season. Mary understood this very well. That's why she was never capricious, unlike most of her classmates. Her grandmother tried very hard to make sure that their small family did not need anything. And Mary also tried because she was not a little girl 12 years old, after all. And now, after school, Mary was selling dairy products on the road leading to the city. There was a private farm in the village called Sullivan's. They had goats and cows. They had a whole farmyard full of animals. They took most of their produce to the city, to the market, but there was always a surplus cottage cheese, milk, sour cream. That's what Mary sold after school for Uncle Sullivan. He even built a special counter and a cart himself. He's got good hands, of course. Mary used that cart every day after school to take the milk to the road. An hour or two and it was sold like hotcakes. Mary had her own regular customers here. Then Mary would return the empty cart to the Sullivans and give them the proceeds. And when they paid her in money, they paid her a percentage of the proceeds when they paid her in natural products. Aunt Tammy also took the young worker out to lunch every time. She almost always refused. She was uncomfortable, even though the neighbors sincerely wanted to treat the girl. Grandmother Veronica received a tiny pension and worked part-time as a cleaner at the local clinic. Every morning and every evening she went to the other end of the village to the old two-story building and washed the floors. In the afternoon she did the housework, cleaning, cooking. Mary helped her, of course. But Grandma Veronica usually sent her granddaughter to her room to do her homework. Go better to your math, you'll have time to wave a rag. You'll work hard in life. Right now you're focused on your studies. Mary knew that it was very important for Grandma Veronica that her granddaughter did well in school, made friends with children from decent families, and got an education. The grandmother was very afraid that the girl would repeat the fate of her parents. She loved Mary and dreamed of a better future for her. And not just dreamed, but did a lot for this. For example, bought Mary books. The girl learned to read early, and by the time she was 8 or 9 years old, she had read all the children's books from the meager local library. And then Grandmother Veronica began to buy Mary books in the city on her small pension. Read, my clever girl. You'll learn, you'll get into people, you'll become a respected and important person. And Grandma Veronica often talked to Mary's teachers about the girl's academic performance. She kept a close eye on it. But here everything was just fine. The girl was one of the best students in the class. And no wonder, because Grandmother Veronica so much engaged with her granddaughter before school and letters she taught her to write, and numbers to add up. And in general, a lot of interesting and important things about the world told. Mary grew up with her grandmother, who was not even her relative according to the documents. In the village, where everyone knew each other, there were no problems with this. Mary's story was common knowledge. Grandma Veronica's son Stephen was a tomboy from childhood. He didn't like to study, nor did he want to. He didn't listen to his mother, and he had no father. Grandma Veronica's husband died when the son was only 2 years old. A heart attack. Unexpected, like a thunderbolt. So the young woman was left a widow with a small child in her arms. She had to carry everything on herself: the house, her son, and her work. Baba Veronica worked as a milkmaid in several shifts at once. How else to feed herself and the child? Stephen grew on his own, like a weed. The woman realized that she should pay more attention to her son, but there was no opportunity. By the time you come back from the evening milking, it's late. And then there's cooking, laundry, and homework to check. Stephen, I must say, has always been a sociable guy. His friends came first. He liked to go out, play with kids, spend time outside the house. At first, his mother was pleased with the easy character of her son. Well, yes, not an angel, of course, but he is a guy. That's normal. But he's so nice to talk to. He's got friends in half the village. When he grows up, he'll be a support for his mother. He'll slowly take over the men's work. But time passed. Stephen grew up. But he wasn't going to help his parents. He still had on his mind only partying with friends, the same knuckleheads like himself. At school, the boy began to skip school, lessons completely abandoned. Once the teachers even wanted to leave the guy for a second year. The mother intervened, begging to give her son a chance to correct. It's such a shame. 2 years in the same class. Veronica begged her son for help. Then she even demanded that he take over the household chores. It was hard for her to carry everything alone, but he always found excuses or just let his mother's words pass his ears. He was tempted by the will, partying, freedom. He came home only late in the evening to sleep and eat. Veronica was in despair. She realized that her son was getting out of hand, but there was nothing she could do about it. "What can you do?" sighed her friends, to whom the woman complained about her situation. "The boy grows up without a father's strictness, without a male example. You, Veronica, have no father, no brother, no one to keep Stephen in check. Well, the army will fix him." After the army, everyone's brains get back in place. Veronica hoped the army would be a miracle. And indeed, home after the service came a completely different Stephen, matured, serious and full of life plans. "I decided to go to the city, to the construction college," he announced his decision to his mother. Veronica rejoiced. Previously, her offspring did not talk about the future at all, living one day at a time. Now he was thinking about studying. "I'll need money for the first time," he added, "until I find a job. They give me a dormitory, but I need something to travel on, something to eat." Of course. Veronica splashed her hands. "What are we talking about?" The woman had some savings. Stephen knew about them. Veronica was saving from her paycheck for a rainy day. You never know. Well, if that was the case, if Stephen decided to study to get on his feet, no money could be spared for that. Veronica was flying on wings back then. Well, look at that. A son getting smart. Stephen got into school and happily informed his mother about it over the phone. He started living on his own in the city. Every month he faithfully showed up for money and told his parents how well he was doing now his studies were going well, and he liked it, and the guys were good. Sometimes, however, he asked for a bigger sum he needed to buy textbooks or repair something in the dormitory. Veronica gave everything, not regretting anything. Then she saved money, sat on bread and water for weeks before the paycheck, just so that her son would be well. After a while, Veronica began to notice that after Stephen's arrival, things disappeared from the house, her only gold earrings, almost new electric kettle, grandmother's ring. Veronica at first blamed it on the neighbors, then thought that she herself put these items somewhere and forgot about them. But then everything fell into place. Veronica began to hear rumors. The child of one of the neighbors entered her son's construction technical school, and it turned out right away that Stephen didn't go there. "You go check everything yourself," advised Veronica this neighbor. "Maybe your son was expelled, but expelled for truancy or failing grades. And he keeps telling you fairy tales." What? A student. So Veronica went. At first she thought she'd give up, because the story she'd painted seemed too unrealistic. Stephen couldn't lie to her, looking her straight in the eye. But doubts crept into the woman's head. So she went. At the dean's office, the truth came out. Turns out Stephen wasn't expelled. It turns out he never even went to this technical school. I mean, he'd been lying to his mom from the beginning. That's probably when the woman realized that all her efforts were for nothing. Her son would never turn out to be a good man. Stephen's a liar, a lazy man. Of course, he's the one who made things disappear from the house. He needs the money. Veronica cried all night that night. Resentment, bitterness, disappointment, it all came down on her like a heavy burden. How many plans, how many hopes were connected with her son? And now what? Was it all for nothing? And hard work, and sleepless nights, and excitement, and anxiety for the child? Or maybe it was her own fault for what had happened to Stephen? Of course she did. After all, in an attempt to earn a penny, Veronica did not pay attention to her son at all, did not check his homework, did not inquire about what was happening in his life. Tiredness, endless fatigue, and lack of time, and no one around who could help with the upbringing of the boy. That's the result. And yet Veronica then managed to convince herself that everything could still be fine. She decided to have a serious conversation with Stephen. The woman determined for herself a line of behavior. She will not blame her son, will not call him a liar. Veronica would simply talk to him seriously and thoroughly. For the first time in a while, it wasn't an easy conversation. Stephen arrived, as usual, to pick up another load of money. He had a carefree smile on his face. But now Veronica saw what his son's eyes were like: insincere, prickly in some way. There was dislike or contempt in them. "I know everything, son," Veronica looked at her son. "About the technical school. Are you in trouble? Tell it like it is." At first, Stephen tried to deny it, but Veronica explained that she had already gone to the dean's office and found out everything. "All right," Stephen bowed his head. "Yes, Mom, you're right. I'm in trouble." It turned out that Stephen was not going to enter the technical school. He realized that he couldn't afford to study, and of course he would fail the entrance exams. He hadn't studied well at school, and miracles don't happen. He wanted to get a job in the city, where you can find sources of income even without education. So he found one, got mixed up with a bad crowd. Guys were burglarizing dacha plots. They took appliances, furniture, clothes, dishes, anything they could sell, and then sell it at the flea market. When Veronica heard about it, she clutched her heart. "Son, how could it be like this? Did I teach you that?" It just happened. Stephen lowered his head below his shoulders. He looked so lost, so remorseful that Veronica felt very sorry for him. Money was needed. There were no other ways to earn it. And so Stephen said he wanted to leave the gang, wanted to return to an honest life. But they wouldn't let him go. "It's these people, Mom. They're threatening me, demanding a ransom for me to leave, a payoff. Otherwise, I'm finished. Why don't we go to the police?" Veronica suggested. What she heard gave her the chills. How could it be? Stephen had always been a lazy bum, a slacker. But to do something like this. "What police? Have you forgotten? I'm just like them. I'll go straight to jail. I don't want to." "So what now?" "There's no way out." "Why not?" "There is. I have to give them the money, like a ransom for me, and then they'll let me go." "How much?" And Stephen said a sum that made Veronica's eyes water. "You see, Mom? It's almost impossible to get out. And I'm so eager to start a new life. Fate has already taught me a lesson. I'm different now. I want to live an honest life. I'll think about what I can do." Veronica nodded. And she thought for a long time, carefully weighed all the pros and cons. She went through different options. The woman was not given a loan for such an amount. Salary is small, age is already pre-retirement. So she had to sell the house, because Veronica had nothing else. "Mom, how did you do it?" rejoiced Stephen, who showed up at his mother's house the following week. Veronica told him everything as it happened. "Where will you live now?" The boy got excited. "I'm already renting a room at Emily's. She's moving to Hope with her son anyway. And I don't think anyone's going to buy it. You know the state of that house. So I rented it from her for next to nothing. I can afford it." "Thank you." Stephen exhaled. "I'll never forget that. I'll buy you a new house. I'll buy you a new house. And not in this neck of the woods, but in the city. We're going to have a life." Stephen disappeared with the money. Veronica realized that it was unlikely that her son's promise would come true, but she had no regrets. She didn't want anything. Only if her son got rid of his bad company and started a new life. That would be her greatest reward. Emily's house, where Veronica now lived, was a tiny wooden hut. One room, a small kitchen, outdoor facilities, creaky floors, shaky roof. But the stove was functioning properly. That's a big deal. Gradually, Veronica settled down in the house, made it cozy, hung new curtains, laid fresh tablecloths, threw out unnecessary junk. With the landlady's permission, of course. Stephen came rarely. Veronica didn't expect Stephen to pay her back. Most of the time he came to borrow money from his mother for living expenses. He seemed to be doing well in the city. He said he worked at a construction site, rented an apartment, and worked from morning till night. The salary was good, but sometimes it was delayed. In those cases, he'd come to his mother's house to scrape together some money. Stephen's life was clearly not easy. He looked thin, pale, eyes dark, troubled. They keep going back and forth. Did the mother believe what her son said about working in the city? Yes and no. He'd been deceived many times before. But on the other hand, Veronica really wanted it to be as Stephen said. It gave her peace of mind. Veronica herself continued to work, but she couldn't pull several shifts as before. age, health was failing her. The labor of a milkmaid is not easy. She had enough to live on, and that was all right. Of course, it was worrying that old age was coming, and Veronica had no corner of her own. What if Emily's kids decided to sell the house? What then? Where would she go? Veronica couldn't afford to rent a decent place. It was a drag, but the woman decided to accept her fate as it was. She couldn't change anything. Her friends criticized her for selling the house and giving all the money to Staving. She'd drunk it, skipped town, and now she was homeless. Veronica just shook her head. She'd look at her friends and neighbors if their children came to them with such a request. They'd probably sell everything too, just to save the child. Veronica didn't regret what she'd done. Staving was disliked in the village, and therefore probably there were different rumors about him. Veronica realized that it could very well be true. Still, she preferred not to believe what people said. They said that Staving was using different substances. They said he was sometimes seen in bad company. Veronica realized that Staving now appeared very rarely. When he did show up, he really didn't look his best. But his son said he worked hard and slept little, and that was why he was so thin. And Veronica wanted to grasp these versions of his story like a drowning man grasping at straws. People lie. All they want to do is scratch their tongues. One day near evening, Staving knocked on the kitchen window. It was late fall, windy, cold, raining. As usual, the son showed up unannounced. But this time the boy wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a woman, thin, with a short haircut, a predatory look, and a smirk on her lips. There was something repulsive about her. But Veronica, of course, did not show her attitude toward the strange visitor. "This is Gabrielle," Staving introduced his companion. "My girlfriend." Veronica smiled at Gabrielle, thinking to herself that she wasn't a girl at all. The lady looked to be in her mid-40s. Her figure was almost girlish thin, and there were deep wrinkles under her eyes and around her mouth. It was obvious that she drank and smoked, not the kind of bride Veronica had dreamed of for her son. So what now? As it turns out, everything in life doesn't go according to plan. The main thing was that they were happy together. Veronica invited the guests to the table. She had a pie cooking in the oven. The woman was going to invite her friends to tea. But since it's like this, "We're going to live here now with you," Staving announced. Veronica almost choked on her pie. Well, that's news. It turned out that the couple had rented an apartment in the city. But Staving had lost his job, and Gabrielle didn't work at all. She was laid off a long time ago, and now they don't hire her anywhere, because soon the woman will go on maternity leave. Who would want a woman like that? You see, Mom, it's a desperate situation, Staving ranted. We've got a baby on the way, and we've got nowhere to live, no money. You can't kick us out. No, of course not. Veronica shook her head. It was a thought she had yet to get used to. Veronica had lived alone in the small house for so long, and the loneliness didn't weigh her down yet. There wasn't enough room for so many people. On the other hand, where would they go? These adults who had never settled down, especially if they had a baby on the way. And Veronica started a whole new life. She didn't particularly like it, but what could she do? A son is a son. She raised him herself. Staving didn't even think about getting a job. Neither did Gabriel. Both of them sat quietly on the neck of the elderly Veronica, as if it was the right thing to do. The woman rightly hoped at least to help with the household chores. But it was no use. Gabriel and Staving quickly found friends in the village, the same pro-lifers as themselves. And so it began partying until morning at their new friend's house, then sleeping until dinner, watching TV, and then all over again. Gabrielle was at ease and relaxed with Veronica. She was not at all embarrassed that she lived in someone else's house and at someone else's expense. This simple manner of communication even somewhat impressed Veronica. Holy simplicity, that's what they called it. Gabrielle had a complicated fate. She grew up in an orphanage, did not know her family. From an apartment from the state, she, then a very young graduate, was cheated. Veronica decided she could re-educate Gabrielle, and Staving's brains would surely fall into place after the baby was born. Except it didn't work out. Mary was born prematurely. Not surprising, given her mother's lifestyle. At first, they didn't want Gabrielle to have the baby at all. The woman was taken by ambulance from the front porch of a convenience store already drugged. But Veronica turned to a neighbor. His son was on the police force, and the little girl was still given to irresponsible parents, under the control and responsibility of a vigilant grandmother. Veronica hoped that the baby's arrival would change things, but it didn't. Gabrielle had no intention of taking care of her newborn daughter. Immediately after the maternity ward, she plunged into her old life with Staving. Veronica had struggled to get the grief-stricken parents to draw up the paperwork for Mary. She completely took care of the child, but something responsible grandmother to do still could not for the registration of documents, attachment to the polyclinic. To solve many other issues needed the official representatives of the girl, that is, the parents. Or rather the mother, because the relationship between Gabrielle and Staving was not formalized, and legally Mary had only her mother. Officially, the grandmother, the only person who cared for the child, was considered a stranger to Mary. It was a bit of a struggle to get the paperwork done, and then Staving and Gabrielle just disappeared one day, leaving the baby in the care of her loving grandmother. To be honest, Veronica breathed a sigh of relief. She had become attached to the little girl from the first days. Of course, it was hard to take care of an infant at such an advanced age. But it's even worse when there are two adults living in the house, leading a dissolute lifestyle. With Staving and Gabrielle gone, things had only gotten better. Veronica was glad that her parents didn't take their daughter with them. The girl simply wouldn't have survived with them. Veronica's heart clenched at the thought of what would happen to the little girl if she suddenly found herself alone with her grief-stricken ancestors. What a cute baby, admired the neighbors, while a happy Veronica rolled the stroller with sleeping Mary down the driveway. When Staving was a baby, the woman had no time to take care of him. Now that she was a grandmother, she was going through this phase all over again. Only now she had a little girl, charming, fragile, touching, with incredibly long eyelashes and soft curls. Yes, a miracle, agreed Veronica. With those closest to her, she shared her fears. I'm afraid Gabrielle will take it away. And yet, why would she need it? Her friends wondered. This is not the kind of person to suddenly arouse love for a child. She doesn't need a girl. And the allowance? Do you get an allowance for your granddaughter yourself? No, Gabrielle gets it all on her card. Well, then calm down, she has money, no worries. Veronica knew the neighbors were right. She even tried to do everything according to the law, appealed to the guardianship authorities. But the niece of one of Veronica's fellow villagers worked in the guardianship. She explained the situation to the woman in a friendly manner. You see, the girl will not be given to her parents, of course, but they will not return her to you either. They'll send her to an orphanage. And why? Veronica gasped. I'm her grandmother according to the documents. You're a stranger to her. And in general, you have no conditions for a child. A rented old house, low income, age. No one will give you the baby. So what do? You just live your life as it is. Ask Gabrielle to give you your allowance card in good faith. You're actually raising a child, that's the only way. Only by agreement. But Veronica didn't go to Gabrielle. Of course, no one would give her the card. But the baby. The mother could take the baby. There's no telling. Maybe she'd even get the idea to sell the girl to someone. That's what they do. They'll do anything for money. And so Mary stayed at Veronica's house on a bird's license. Gabrielle and Staving made occasional visits to the village. They came to see their daughter. They smiled at the girl, but shunned her. For her, they were strangers, strange people whom her grandmother was clearly afraid of. Staving once again borrowed money from his mother, and the sweet couple went away. One day the police knocked on Veronica's door, not local, from the city. They said Staving was dead. The substances he'd been using had taken his health and then his life. Mary was about 6 years old at the time. Only the need to care for her granddaughter kept Veronica from drowning in black grief. Yes, Staving's lifestyle was wrong and very dangerous, but his mother hoped, sincerely believed that sooner or later he would take up his mind, become different for the sake of his daughter. Veronica saw that Mary Gabrielle wasn't interested at all. Well, that's good. It was better for the little girl to stay with her grandmother than to live with such a mother or in an orphanage. Life went on as usual. Veronica retired and began to work part-time as a cleaner. She practiced a lot with her granddaughter, trying not to make the same mistakes she had made with her son. Mary grew up quite different, not like Stephen, attentive, affectionate, hardworking. She tried to help her grandmother in everything, which especially touched Veronica's heart. No one had taken such care of her for a long time. Mary studied well, obeyed her grandmother in everything. And then she found a part-time job selling milk at the Savliev's on the road. At first, Veronica was worried who knows who drives there on the road frightened the girl or worse. But then she calmed down. Mary was a smart and clever girl, mature beyond her years. She had a good sense of people and knew how to behave with strangers, and the money the girl earned was not at all superfluous. Mary knew her story. Veronica had told her granddaughter about it 4 years ago. The girl naturally asked questions about her parents. Veronica did not consider it necessary to invent beautiful fairy tales. All the same, someone from the village sooner or later will open her eyes to the truth. There was no hiding the truth. It was better to tell Mary about Stephen and Gabrielle herself, choosing her words carefully so as not to traumatize the child. The granddaughter was not particularly upset, because the girl did not know these people before. So what did she have to worry about? True, Mary would certainly be interested to know more about Gabrielle for her mother. Her mother was still alive. Mary knew that Gabrielle was somewhere in town. Sometimes they even heard from mutual acquaintances Gabrielle had a new boyfriend, or she was in the hospital again. Veronica prayed to God that Gabrielle would live to see Mary come of age. After all, if something happened to her, the guardianship authorities would then be obliged to find her daughter and place the child in an orphanage. In the meantime, so far, so good. Mary never told Baba Vera about it, so as not to upset her. But she often thought about her mother and father. She fantasized about how her fate would have been if they'd been ordinary people. And now, too, a beautiful car was speeding down the highway. Mary could see a family in it, a middle-aged man at the wheel, a woman next to him, probably his wife, and a girl about her age in the back. All three were laughing and talking almost simultaneously. They were probably discussing something pleasant. Mary smiled as she escorted the car with a glance. Happy. I wish she could be like that. It's all right. Grandma's life is not bad either. When Mary grows up, she will buy a nice house in the city, where she and her grandmother will live together. But she'll have to study first, get a good job. A house. This word has recently become somehow alarming, because recently something happened that was so afraid of Grandma Vera. The owner of the house where Grandma and Mary lived had died, and her children wished to sell the old house. The buyer for such a wreck will not be found quickly, but they have already advertised. So sooner or later, she and Grandma are going to have to move out. But where to? Grandma Vera is very worried about it. She tries not to show it in front of her granddaughter, but Mary notices not a little girl. Recently, the girl heard a conversation between her grandmother and a neighbor. I feel that we will soon go to the world with Mary. Money is not enough to rent a normal room is not enough. I don't know what to do. Beg her Gabrielle and she demands to share her pension. Veronica was very worried about the housing situation. She realized that their modest income would not be enough to rent a normal room. Veronica could not demand money from Gabrielle, fearing that she would take Mary for herself, and the girl would end up in terrible conditions or worse in an orphanage. Mary saw how hard it was for her grandmother, and her heart shrank with pity for the only native person. But how could the girl help in such a situation? Probably the only possible support from her not to create unnecessary problems and earn a little at least for bread and milk. Mary had sold off almost all her goods. There was only 1.5-liter bottle of milk and a jar of sour cream left. Just a little more and we could go back. That was good, because Mary was already freezing in the fresh October wind in her light raincoat. In spite of the cold, Mary sincerely admired the scenery. Behind her was a wide field crossed by a dusty country road. The grass had already withered a little. But not so long ago the steppe was blooming with bright multicolored flowers. But even now it is beautiful here. And on the other side of the highway stretches a forest. The bushes and trees are beautiful now. If Mary knew how to draw, she would have put this beauty on paper. What colors: gold, purple, bright yellow leaves. All mixed together. The eye is delighted. Suddenly the girl's attention was attracted by something strange, some movement on the other side of the highway. It was as if the bushes on the left side were moving. Mary looked closely. Was it just a vision? No. On the other side of the road there was a rustle, and the bushes moved again. The girl froze. It wasn't that she was frightened, but it sounded like someone big in the bushes. Mary cautiously approached the old woman. She was clearly distraught and mumbled something inaudible to her son. She seemed to be delirious, perhaps because of hypothermia or some disease. The girl squatted down next to the old woman and softly called out to her grandmother, "Can you hear me? What happened to you?" But the old woman did not react in any way, continuing to mumble and stare somewhere in the void with glazed eyes. Mary realized she couldn't do it alone. She had to call for help. She jumped to her feet and ran back to the road. Her heart was pounding frantically from fear and from running fast. When she reached the roadside, Mary stopped, trying to catch her breath and frantically thinking about what to do next. It would take a long time to get to the village, and it would take a long time to find one of the adults. And the old woman needs help right now. Suddenly, she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A car was coming down the road. Mary waved her arms, trying to get the driver's attention. The car started to slow down. "Please help me. There's a grandmother lying in the bushes. She's sick." Mary, who was out of breath, shouted as she ran toward the stopped car. A middle-aged man got out of the car. After listening to the girl's confused story, he nodded and pulled out his cell phone. "Okay, I see. Now I'll call an ambulance. And you run to your grandmother. See that it doesn't get worse. I'll be right there." Mary exhaled a sigh of relief, thanked the man, and ran back to the old lady. Now at least she wasn't alone in this frightening situation. Help was on the way. Mary shuddered at the old woman's words. It seemed that this grandmother wanted to harm her own son. His name is Leonid. Or maybe it's all a delusion. The old lady's in a terrible state. But what if it's not a delusion? What if this same Leonid right now is watching them from deep in the woods and understands perfectly well that now the girl knows too much? Mary had goosebumps running down her spine. She looked around. It seemed quiet. We must act. The old woman needs help. The girl didn't see any injuries on her body, but there's no telling what her own son had done to her. Maybe he poisoned her? Mary herself cannot help her grandmother. She cannot even lift her. So we must run to the village and call the grown-ups. They'll sort it out for sure. Leaving the tray of unsold goods on the road, Mary ran as fast as she could into the village. She had never run so fast before. The wind whistled in her ears, her hair fluttered behind her back. Soon the girl felt hot. Wasn't it only a short time ago that she was shivering on the road? Already near the village, she met her neighbors, Uncle Peter and Uncle Stanley. The girl, panting, told them everything. "Show me where." Uncle Peter commanded. Mary nodded and ran in another direction. The men followed her. Aunt Angie, Uncle Stanley's wife, heard their dialogue. She immediately rushed into the village. Mary knew that now everyone would know about her terrible discovery. And that's a good thing. The grown-ups would figure out what to do. The responsibility that had weighed heavily on the girl's fragile shoulders seemed to evaporate. The adults were now in charge. On the way, Mary suddenly wondered if she had dreamed it all. The old woman in the bushes, her blue handkerchief, her eyes staring into the distance. But no, the grandmother was still lying in the bushes, only she was no longer talking. Mary was even afraid at first that she was too late for help. She became very frightened. "She's alive," Uncle Peter exclaimed, gently lifting the old woman off the ground. "How did she get here?" Puzzled Uncle Stanley, "It doesn't look as if she'd gone mushrooming." "There's no basket, and it's not a mushrooming place," said one of the crowd. The other villagers came up. Aunt Angie did her job and got everyone on their feet. Among the crowd, Mary saw Grandma Vera. Seeing a loved one, the girl was relieved. "We need an ambulance," exclaimed one of the women. "By the time they reach us, so much time will pass," said Grandma Vera. "The man will freeze. Peter, take her to our house, or Grandma will catch cold in the wind. We'll wait for the doctors there." "I've already called an ambulance," said Uncle Stanley. "But the police too, just in case." The old woman was brought to the house where Grandma Vera and Mary lived. They laid her on the bed and covered her with a blanket. Mary watched carefully the old woman, who now seemed to be asleep. She waited to see if she would say something again. But the old woman was silent. The women crowded into the room and speculated about the old woman's fate. Maybe she had gone for mushrooms? Lost her way? She wandered and wandered through the woods, but she got on the road, said one. No, objected another. That can't be true. Such a thing would definitely be on the news, that a man was missing. And here is silence. I think she's not herself. You know, she's out of her mind from old age, so she left. She's a lonely grandmother, so they haven't missed her yet. Mary remembered the words the old woman had said in the heat of forgetfulness. The old woman lamented that her son Leo wanted to get rid of her, but in front of the neighbors the girl did not voice this monologue. First of all, it is not very likely, suddenly seemed to her. The old woman spoke very quietly, barely audible. Secondly, for some reason Mary did not want this fact to go around the village. The local gossips liked to exaggerate and embellish things. No, Mary would tell her grandmother when they were alone. In the meantime. For now, it's best to keep quiet. The police were the first to arrive. They took Mary's statement, asked how the girl came across the old woman. What did she do afterwards? It's good that the uniformed men didn't specify directly whether this grandmother said something or not. Mary couldn't lie to the face of the law. And the locals were eager to catch every word she said so they could pass it on. Then the doctors showed up. Mary breathed a sigh of relief when she saw a white car pull up to their gate. Now she would be helped. They loaded the old woman on a stretcher and carried her to the car. Baba Vera, on realizing this, jumped out after them. From the window, Mary could see her talking to the men in white coats. They're taking her to Springfield, Vera explained when she returned to the house. We should visit her afterward. You don't know what it's like if a person has no one. How does it feel when no one visits you in the hospital? When everyone had gone, Mary told Baba Vera what she'd heard from the old woman. Why didn't you tell the police? Grandmother aghast. I don't know, she shrugged her shoulders. I thought, if the old woman didn't want it, or was she just having some kind of a delusion? That's right, too, agreed Grandma Vera. You're a good girl, you're growing up. You're not a gossip, you don't talk for nothing. You think 100 times, then you speak. Mary smiled at her grandmother. Is she going to be all right? I don't know. I've been trying to ask the doctors, but they've been getting away with it. Let's hope so. We did the best we could. It's a good thing I saw the bushes moving, Mary said, and shrugged her shoulders shakily. She imagined what would have happened to the old woman if the girl had not been on the road at the right time. A week passed. During this time, they found out the identity of the old woman. It turned out that this is a resident of the village, which is located at a distance of about 50 kilometers from the place where Mary found her grandmother. Locals unanimously assured that she lives alone, although she has an adult son. He seemed to live in the city and rarely appeared at his mother's house. The old woman had given up lately. She almost never got out of bed, she could hardly move around the house. And now suddenly she was in the woods, and so far from her home. Mary watched with curiosity as Grandma Vera was going somewhere. Where are you going, Grandma? Asked the girl. The hospital called me. I gave my phone number to the Felger and asked him to let me know when it would be possible to visit the old woman. And what? She came to her senses. Mary exclaimed with joy. All this time she had been very worried about that grandmother. She felt sorry for her. She came to her senses a long time ago, but the visit was allowed only now, smiled Grandma Vera. I'll go and visit her. I baked her some pies. The neighbors say that she is a lonely grandmother. It will probably be pleasant to her, such attention. I'm coming with you, Mary said with confidence. I want to talk to her too. Is that convenient? Grandma Vera was confused. I don't know if it's necessary. After all, I'm the one who found her. All right, what's the matter now? Get ready then. The bus will be here in 15 minutes. Mary thought it would be just like the movie she liked to watch. She and her grandmother would go up to the whitewashed room where the rescued old woman would be lying on a bed, all wrapped in wires. But no. The strict receptionist from the waiting room told the visitors to wait for the patient downstairs on a leather couch. There were already a lot of people here, patients in gowns, pajamas, and slippers, and their relatives and friends who came to check on their own. Soon the old woman appeared. Mary was the first to see her and recognized her immediately. Her grandmother looked much better now, still thin, but her face was no longer that frightening dead pallor, and her light green eyes looked quite conscious and very friendly. "How do you do?" said Baba Vera, waving her hand. Now she too noticed the old woman. The patient smiled and moved towards the visitors. It was only then that Mary realized that the grandmother didn't know who had come to see her. They had seen her that October day, but she wasn't in the right state to remember their faces. "Hello," smiled the old woman, coming closer. A kind, warm smile, good, calm. "So it was you who saved me then?" "My granddaughter, Mary," answered Grandma Vera. "Thank you, girl. I don't know what would have happened to me if it hadn't been for your attentiveness. Of course I do. But I don't want to think about it, no matter what." Then they all got to know each other. Turns out the old lady's name is Poppy Parson. She lives in the next village, quite a long way from where Mary found her. "How on earth did you get here?" wondered Grandma Vera. She looked very young compared to Poppy Parson. There must have been 10 or 12 years difference between them. "It's a sad story," sighed Poppy Parson. "I've been ill, I've been sick. I got weak. I thought it was the end of me. But I don't know. It was like my mind went blank. Something came over me. I gathered up my last strength and went wherever I was going, without any purpose. It was like someone was calling me from the woods. Temporary insanity. So I must have reached you somehow, and then I collapsed from exhaustion. And Mary found me." Baba Vera shook her head sadly. For some reason, Mary did not believe this part of Poppy Parson's story. It seemed to her that the old woman was hiding something from them. Otherwise, the new acquaintance was quite sincere and pleasant to talk to. Mary could see that she and Vera had found a common language. A couple of minutes later, the women were already discussing a variety of topics: health, news, weather. And they couldn't get enough of talking, like old friends. They also had a common misfortune: their wayward sons. Poppy Parson's son was outwardly a prosperous man. He studied, married, settled in the city. But his mother's life hadn't interested him since. He became like a complete stranger to the one who had raised him and put him on his feet. Baba Vera was so moved by this story that she even cried. Poppy Parson couldn't hold back her tears either. She could see that the situation with her son was causing her real heartache. Mary looked at the grandmothers talking to each other and thought about whether or not to ask Poppy Parson about what she had mumbled while lying in the bushes. It was awkward to touch the subject. And Grandma Vera, as if she had forgotten what her granddaughter had told her. She didn't ask anything either. Or maybe she really forgot, didn't care. "Oh, poor Poppy," sighed Grandma Vera on the way back. "She raised her son alone, just like me, stretched, tried, did so much for him, and he left her alone, and he lives happily in the city. He's got a wife there, a family. He's forgotten his mother. He doesn't care that she's sick. She's been lying around the house for so long, barely able to walk. Neighbors ran to the store for her, but not her son. What a fate. I guess we're a bit like Poppy, me and her. Why didn't you ask her? I told you about what she was mumbling in the bushes. About Leo's son. Like he was the one who was trying to ruin her. And anyway," sighed Grandma Vera, looking at her granddaughter. "She seems to be a smart girl, but sometimes she just blabs. Do you think she would be pleased to hear that? Especially since Poppy told her how she got into the woods. Her son had nothing to do with it. And the fact that it's him. I think that's what she really thought in her delirium. And there's some truth to what she said. Of course, Leo almost ruined his mother with his indifference, betrayal, oblivion. Good, at least the doctors pulled her out, cured her. As they say, there is no good without good. If Poppy had not been in the hospital, so slowly and would have died at home, alone. And now she's been treated for her heart condition. And now she'll live another 100 years on the new pills." Mary shook her head. Still, something in this story bothered her very much. Baba Vera and Mary visited Poppy a few more times. The old ladies had become very friendly. It was good that things had worked out that way. One day, said Poppy, "It was worth being lost in the woods to meet good people like you." "We'll be friends now," smiled Grandma Vera. "We won't get away from each other now." And such a light atmosphere arose around the three of them. Such a trusting atmosphere, that Mary finally made up her mind. "Baba Poppy," said the girl. As it happened, that was what she had begun to call Poppy. "Can I ask you something?" Baba Vera looked at her granddaughter warningly, but she decided that she would go through with it. "Of course you can," dear Poppy smiled at her. There in the bushes, when I found you, for some reason you said that your son Leo, that he decided to send you to the other world. I thought he'd done something to you and left you in the woods. What a restless little brat," exclaimed Grandma Vera angrily. "Forgive her, her tongue is boneless, and her imagination is irrepressible, always thinking of something. But she's right." Poppy shook her head. Her eyes suddenly became so sad that Mary immediately regretted having asked her question. She had to know the truth, though. After all, if Leo was really guilty of something, then Poppy was still in danger, and Mary cared about her fate. The girl was worried about her and her grandmother's new acquaintance. "What do you mean?" "She's right." Grandma Vera didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "It's true, friend," Poppy decided. "I'll tell you my story. I'm ashamed, of course, to confess such things. In my delirium, I told the truth. Leo, my only son, really wanted to send me to the afterlife. It's a hard thing to realize. I didn't fully believe it, but everything says it's true. It's unfortunate. Poppy raised her son alone. In that, she was a lot like Grandma Vera. But the reasons why the women's sons were left fatherless were different. Baba Vera's husband died of a heart attack. But with Poppy's husband, Andrew, it was a different story. Young Poppy met her future husband by chance at the harvest. They sent them then in the village help young people from the city. Among them, and Andrew was cheerful, humorous, the soul of the company. He amused the whole brigade with his jokes. He didn't work too fast himself. It's understandable, a city dweller not used to the land. But he cheered everyone up. Andrew was everyone's favorite at first. He was funny, a good-natured joker. And a good-looking one, too. Bright blue eyes, hair the color of ripe wheat. A wide, open smile. Poppy was being courted by a former classmate of hers, Jerry. He was a nice guy, quiet and thorough. And she seemed to like him in every way. You couldn't go wrong with a guy like that. With such a family, life will be nourished and measured, right? But against Andrew's background, Jerry suddenly seemed to Poppy somehow small, simple. With the arrival of a cheerful city boy in the village, Poppy's eyes were fixed only on him. And not just her eyes. To the great annoyance of young Poppy, there were girls around Andrew, both local and visiting, making eyes at him, trying to talk to the handsome guy. He didn't say no to anyone. He tried to pay attention to everyone. This caused unpleasant feelings in Poppy's soul, something like jealousy. The girl self-corrected for incomprehensible feelings. Well, what does she expect at all? He is not for her a bird, not her flight. He is so handsome, so modern, so fashionable, as if a guy from the movies. And she's a country shepherdess who gets lost in his presence. No eyebrows as black as felt boots, no statuesque figure, no mop of hair down to her waist, nothing to look at. Why would Andrew want her when he could have anyone? But Andrew chose her. It came as a complete surprise to Poppy. At that moment, the guy approached her at the disco, which was organized in the local club on the occasion of the end of the harvest. Andrew invited Poppy to dance and said words that made the girl dizzy. She had never heard such exquisite compliments, especially to herself. Andrew knew how to choose beautiful words, and his gaze, directed at Poppy, reflected sincere admiration. Much later, Poppy realized why Andrew had taken notice of her. He was a charming catcher with charisma, who had nothing to do in the city he did not want to work, but needed a roof over his head. Rumors of orphan Poppy, living alone and in need of support, reached Andrew the perfect chance for him. To settle in the village and win the heart of a naive girl, he was not difficult. So they began to live together, the city's handsome man and Poppy, who was in love with him. The wedding was held modestly in the spring. The young people had no money for a party. Poppy worked as a librarian for a small salary, and Andrew worked at odd jobs. Although trained as a painter, he allegedly could not get a job in his specialty. If he could earn money, he spent it on entertainment, pulling his friends into his feasts. Jerry, Poppy's former lover, had a hard time with their separation, but Poppy's heart belonged to Andrew from the day he appeared in the village. Andrew was never able to get used to life in the village house. Andrew had spent his whole life in the city, and therefore the usual village chores were difficult for him. No wood to chop, no fire to light in the stove. He wasn't used to hard work. Poppy had to show and tell him everything. Unprepared was the discovery that the house requires constant attention and repair, and to take care of the site must be regular. In winter, the snow is cleared every day, and water from the well for hundreds of meters to carry is not easy. All this depressed Andrew life in the countryside seemed different to him. As soon as I get a proper job in the city, we'll move, he kept telling Poppy. Deep down, he liked the countryside fresh air, kind people, but life seemed too hard. Poppy supported him. She was ready to follow Andrew anywhere, even to the city, even to the end of the world. But time passed, and he never found a steady job, while Poppy's salary remained a stable source of income. People in the village began to whisper Poppy's young husband was living a life of leisure, sitting on her neck, never lifting a finger in the house. I wish you'd married Jerry, Poppy, complained the neighbor. He's a reliable fellow, he still loves her. But what about him? Riding around on your back, having fun with his buddies. Indeed, Andrew often gathered with local guys, organized feasts, went for a drive, sometimes with girls. There were rumors around the village about his infidelity, but Poppy didn't want to hear any of it. She ignored the talk, though deep down she was afraid for Andrew and possible trouble on the roads. Poppy hoped that having a baby would change family life. Fatherhood usually made men more responsible and mature. She still genuinely loved Andrew for his charm, his blue eyes, and his optimistic attitude. Next to him, the world seemed brighter and fuller. Without him, life seemed dull and gray. But Andrew's actions still offended her. Attempts to talk seriously usually ended in jokes, and Poppy forgot her worries again under his influence. When Poppy became pregnant, Andrew's reaction was not a happy one. He even suggested terminating the pregnancy, arguing that it was because they were young and their lives were unsettled. But Poppy insisted, feeling they would have a son. Andrew eventually supported his wife's decision and began to actively look for work, but without results. Still, Poppy was happy to see his efforts. The birth of their son Leo changed everything for Poppy. Her world now revolved around her son, evoking much stronger feelings than those she had had for her husband. Her view of Andrew had also changed. The woman now saw all the faults she had previously turned a blind eye to. His indifference to housework and lack of attention to his son were now conspicuous. Andrew put almost no effort into caring for the newborn. The entire family was now struggling to make ends meet, living on minimal payments from the government. It seemed that Andrew didn't even seek to make a difference. There had long been an opportunity to learn how to at least repair something around the house or chop wood, but he had not shown the slightest desire. With the arrival of the baby and Poppy's fascination with motherhood, Andrew tended to avoid the house, spending time with friends. He returned home late, often in a state of alcoholic intoxication, and did not get out of bed until dinner. To his wife's reproaches, Andrew now responded with harshness and even insults. "Why do you think I don't want to go home? Because I hate to look at you," he'd say, which was particularly depressing to Poppy. Pulling on the whole household, especially in the absence of money, was unbearably hard for Poppy. She was grateful for the help of neighbors. One of them could take care of the child while Poppy went out on business. Someone brought groceries. Even old baby clothes from neighborhood kids helped save money. While the local community supported Poppy, Andrew continued to cheat, promising to earn money in town but returning without it. Rumors reached Poppy about his entertaining in town with friends and young girls. Now she agreed with the opinion of the neighbors about her husband. He behaved unworthily, proved to be lazy and deceitful. Instead of giving the money he earned to his family, Andrew spent it on pleasure. Who do you listen to? Andrew resented Poppy when she questioned him. Your husband or the gossips? Those in town cheated again, gave less than they promised. Yeah, I went to a pub with a friend, had a little drink. There must be some joy in life. When Leo grew up, she decided to divorce because it was unbearable to live like that. Now, working and handling money made it easier. She realized that she could support a child on her own, but to support her son and her constantly unemployed husband, who likes to party, was much more difficult. Ever since Andrew had gone from an attractive blue-eyed guy to a local alcoholic, his charisma and charm had vanished as if they had never existed. The cloudy eyes, the unhealthy complexion, the gaunt look. Andrew was now taking money from his wife's purse, her paycheck he needed for drinks. He wasn't shy about getting funds that way. At first she could not even believe it, looking for other reasons. Maybe one of the children at school took it, maybe she herself put somewhere. But soon the woman realized that it was Andrew who was doing it. That realization was the last straw. For the first time in her life, Poppy gave her husband a real scandal. She expressed everything she thought about him in every possible way. At first he was shocked, and then he almost lashed out at her. Poppy thought that now, after such humiliation, Andrew would attack her. But her husband held back. He just swung. "Get out of my house and out of my life," Poppy said firmly, surprised at the determination in her voice. "We're getting a divorce. I don't want a husband like that. And our son shouldn't have to see that kind of example every day." Yes, Poppy did it for her son's sake first and foremost. Leo deserved to live in a calm and normal environment. A father who constantly spent his time partying and drinking was definitely not what he needed. It's best for everyone, they decided. Andrew, at first frightened, tried to convince Poppy not to make a rash move. For a while he even changed. He stopped drinking and found himself a more or less stable part-time job. However, his determination did not last long. Soon he returned to his old way of life. Poppy, seeing no other way out, divorced him and kicked him out of the house. Where he would go and where he would live now, she no longer cared. The main thing was to keep Andrew away from her and their child. Poppy was calmer and easier without him. It was a paradox. Andrew left and a new phase began in Poppy's life with her son. Life didn't get easier, but at least it became calmer and more orderly. Left alone with her son, it was as if Poppy had found freedom. Leo was still very young and did not have time to get attached to his father, who often disappeared from home or spent time on his adventures. Poppy worked hard. After working in the library, she washed the floors at school to bring home an extra penny. Leo did not need anything. There were clothes and delicious food and toys, although for this had to work very hard. The boy grew up on his own, like many village children, and at first Poppy thought that in time she would find it easier. But the burden of housework remained on her shoulders. Leo did not help around the house, finding a lot of excuses, from a lot of lessons to a pain in the head. At the same time, he always had time to go out with friends and ride his bike. Poppy was lenient about it, thinking it was important for a child to have a happy childhood, and didn't want to hurt her son by not being able to create a complete family for him. Is it really worth depriving Leo of these happy moments of childhood? Let him enjoy it, and when he grows up, he'll realize everything himself, Poppy thought. But as Leo grew up, the situation in the family did not get easier. The boy did not want to help around the house, and his interest in his studies was very superficial. He passed from class to class almost out of respect for his mother, who worked at the same school as a librarian. Poppy asked the teachers and talked to the headmaster. It would have been too shameful for Leo to stay on for a second year. The village treated the hard-working woman with warmth and understanding. But as the neighbor and predicted, everything was going to the end of their story will be sad. Already at school, Leo began to be fond of drinking, began to communicate with not very good company of older guys. Poppy tried to keep those guys away from Leo, even threatened them with the police, but they only laughed at her concern. The situation escalated when Leo was taken to the police for attempted shoplifting. He was released thanks to the local community's understanding of Poppy's situation, who was bearing the brunt of raising her son alone. The older Leo got, the clearer Poppy realized that he was following in his father's footsteps. She even saw it as a kind of punishment for having once kicked Andrew out, who soon finally rolled over and died. Poppy couldn't help but feel guilty about her ex-husband's fate and the fact that she seemed unable to stop the sad cycle of fate in her family. The woman's heart was breaking with pain and despair. Anna tried to talk to Leo, to convey to him the simple truths of life, hoping that she could still change his path. Her mother's words didn't seem to reach Leo, as his blank and indifferent stare testified. Perhaps Poppy should have started acting sooner, but the hustle and bustle of providing a family with a life distracted her, and she hadn't realized it at the time. She believed that the example of parents was the most important thing in education. But she hadn't considered the influence of heredity, which now had such a profound effect on Leo. He began to follow his father's path, taking money from Poppy's bag, coming home drunk, putting everything on his mother's shoulders, living for his own pleasures. After school, he didn't go on to further education, probably because of his poor grades. Poppy tried to get him a job on the farm, but he ran away after a few days. "What are you trying to do, make a slave out of me? I'll be busting my back out there," he complained to his mother, and accused her of depriving him of his parental support by kicking his father out. Leo's words hit Poppy where it hurt the most, that maybe she could have done something differently and prevented this outcome. In an instant, She felt very dizzy and realized that it was pointless to argue with her son. When Leo left for the city, Poppy was disturbed but didn't bother him, hoping that perhaps there was something different waiting for him there that wasn't in the village. The years passed and Leo was rarely in the village, sometimes calling his mother and telling her that he was doing well, that he had got a job in a factory, had qualified and was renting an apartment. Poppy, listening to his stories, despite all his past troubles, felt a restrained joy for her son. There was still a note of hope in her heart that Leo's life would turn out better than his father's. If that was indeed the case, Poppy could finally relax. Leo seemed to have found himself. However, Poppy couldn't fully believe him. Their family history was full of deception. But the reasoning that Leo was living somewhere and earning something was hopeful. Unfortunately, Leo chose the wrong path. He ended up in jail, but thanks to the fact that he was caught the first time, he was not in jail for long. In prison, his mother visited him, sympathizing with him. After being released early, Leo returned home serious and slimmed down. But the temporary return to the village did not detain him, and he went to the city again. Before leaving, he assured his mother that he could start a new life. "I've learned from my mistakes, become wiser," he said. And it seemed he had indeed changed. In the city, Leo married Margot, a nurse with a difficult fate. Leo introduced Margot to his mother as a respectful, pleasant, and kind woman who had been through some difficult trials in her life, including the loss of her son, Poppy. Seeing how Margot genuinely loved Leo, finally accepted her. She began to hope that after all the hardships and mistakes, her son would have a good life after all. Over the years, life settled down. Leo and Margot settled in the city and rarely visited Poppy, which was understandable because they were so busy. The most important thing for Poppy was to know that her son and his family were doing well. Margot and Leo had a daughter, Emily. The baby girl was incredibly sweet. Poppy was immensely happy for them. Margot had found the joy of motherhood again, and Leo, having become a father, had no doubt changed for the better, especially having such a beautiful daughter. Poppy, however, saw her granddaughter rarely. Each visit was a holiday for her. Her love for her granddaughter filled her heart. As she grew older, Poppy asked her son more and more often to bring Emily on vacation, assuring her that she would have fun in the countryside. "It's so nice here in the summer. It's a great place to be," she said. But the son waved off the suggestions, and Margot admitted that she was afraid to let her daughter go after losing her son. Poppy understood that. The terrible events had left a deep mark on Margot's soul, and her fear of losing loved ones was understandable. As time went on, Poppy felt the loneliness, especially when her health began to fail. She could no longer even walk to the well without resting. The local boys helped her, for which she was grateful. Poppy's spirits were kept high by the thought that her family was doing well. It seemed a miracle to her that Leo had finally found happiness in family life and stability. She was happy for him, although she was sad that he was making less frequent appearances in the village. It had been like this for several years. Occasionally, Leo would call to tell her about his health and share news. His granddaughter Emily had graduated from high school and entered law school. Margot, smart and beautiful, works but suffers from blood pressure, so she has no time to travel. Her son works in a factory. Oh, well, that's all right. The main thing is that he's getting his head on straight. The fact that he's inattentive and insensitive is just the way he is, and he's loved just as much for it. Poppy's heart condition worsened. She sighed as she watched a neighbor who had come to visit. Her health had given up completely. The local doctors could only throw up their hands and send her to the city for tests. There was no equipment here. She asked for help from her son, and although he did not refuse, but all postponed then work, then the enrollment of her daughter, or himself did not feel well. Poppy's health was deteriorating, and she could hardly move around the house. Neighbors helped by bringing food from the store. She was grateful. "I thought my days were numbered." Nobody's immortal. She was getting on in years. She marveled at every morning, feeling the joy of a new day. One day Leo arrived unexpectedly, all in a dark frame of mind. "Is there anything to eat?" he asked at once on the doorstep. Poppy shook her head with difficulty. "No, Leo, I'm not getting up at all. There's something left in the fridge, bread and sausage. Make yourself some sandwiches." Leo sighed heavily, and went to the kitchen to boil the kettle and make sandwiches, forgetting about his mother's suggestion. He had always been like that, preoccupied only with himself. Such a character was influenced neither by upbringing nor scolding in childhood. "I left Margot," the son finally said. Poppy's heart clenched with pain. She was sure Leo had settled into the best possible life. What to do now? Why? She cheated on me, the traitor. And she made me work like a galley before that. She didn't see me as a human being. She said I had to succeed in my career, take care of my daughter, work at home. Without all that, she didn't need me. But son, that's just life. The man is the head of the family, his support and protection. Tried to comfort Poppy. Here we go. Do you think it's nice to know you're being used? We've built a life together, and now what? I'm allowed to ignore me and find someone wealthier. My daughter's turned against me too. Emily doesn't even want to see me anymore. Why is that? Because I reacted when I found out about her lover. You hit her. Poppy couldn't believe it. Well, not exactly. Just pushed and slapped her. I had a temper, Leo explained. Poppy could understand him. Margot seemed to be behaving like Leo's father, drinking, partying, not working enough, not participating in household chores, expecting her husband to take care of her, thinking it was the norm. Margot couldn't stand it and kicked the slacker out of her apartment. And apparently she got a decent man. You had a family? Did you ruin your own happiness? Poppy sighed. She cheated on me. She ruined the family, not me, replied the son. Poppy only sighed heavily. What are you going to do now? She asked. I guess I'm going to live here for a while. Shrugged his shoulders. When you're not well, I'll help you get better, and then we'll see. Are you sick? I'm very sick. Agreed, Poppy. Not long I have left. The medicine does not help much. You need to go to the city for examination. And then Leonid's face suddenly brightened. Anna noticed this moment, when something clicked in his head. Only then she could not even imagine to what conclusion Leo had reached. I'm taking you to the city, Leo said. We have to make arrangements with the doctor, find a car. Margot borrowed my car in the divorce. Maybe she'll lend it to me for such an occasion. There was a spark of hope in Poppy's heart. Maybe her son really could help. He was worried and was already making plans to get his mother into hospital. She was pleased by her son's concern. The attention of grown-up children really is priceless. A few days passed. Leo disappeared in the city from morning till evening, coming home late at night and telling her that he was solving her problems. She had waited and hoped so much. Her condition began to worsen, though she didn't stop taking the medications prescribed by the local doctors. But afterward, she began to suspect. Leo, suddenly caring, was giving her pills. The size and taste of the medicine had changed. The woman noticed it, but didn't pay much attention to it, as well as to the fact of finding the vitamin pack in the trash. Only later in the woods, Poppy realized instead of vital drugs, her son gave her harmless vitamins. That's why she was feeling worse and worse. Leo must have thought she was fading too slowly. One afternoon, a car pulled up to the gate and Leo got out. It must have been Margot's after all. We're going into town, Leo said as he came into the house. I found the car. They're waiting at the hospital. The timing was good. Poppy was barely out of bed, weakening by the hour. Leo helped her pack and carried her mother in his arms to the car, constantly looking around. Only later did she realize why he did so. At that moment, almost everyone was busy, and no one should have noticed that he was taking his mother out of the village. The journey had begun. Poppy looked out the window curiously, enlivened by the sights she hadn't seen in so long. Her heart sang with joy, for her son was beside her and everything was going according to plan. Suddenly, Leo turned off the highway onto a country road, stopped the car, and helped her out. He set her down on the soft grass and said, "What are you doing?" She asked. "Sit a little, get some fresh air, and I'm here near." "I need to go to the bushes," replied the son. But Leo did not go in the direction of the bushes and returned to the car and started the engine. Poppy, dumbfounded, asked Leo, "What's going on?" Only now did she realize everything she had not noticed before. Leo said, "You're going to die soon anyway, but my house will be. I'm in debt, I'm being threatened, I'm just hastening the inevitable." "What on earth are you doing?" Poppy gasped, gripped by fear not for herself, but for her son. "Don't worry, I won't get caught," Leo said confidently. "The neighbors already know you're better. They'll think you went for a walk and got lost. No one will know anything. Leo, how will you live after all this?" "Think about it." She tried to dissuade him. "I'll live. And you don't care anymore." He cut her off abruptly. Poppy stared after the car, not believing that her son had really left. She called out to him, begged him to stay, but in vain. Alone in the middle of the clearing, she cried with helplessness and loss. But soon she shook herself, found her footing and set off, following the sound of the motor. But she made a mistake and collapsed from exhaustion. It seemed her son's plan was on the verge of fulfillment. But then she was found. As she finished her story, Poppy looked at her amazed listeners with tears in her eyes. "You know everything now. Wow," exhaled the girl. Baba Vera hugged Poppy tightly and asked, "And where's your Leo now?" "They were looking for him, determined my identity. Tried to find my son. He is my only relative. But they couldn't. He disappeared. Even put out a bolo. I don't know what happened to him. Maybe those to whom he owed something did something to him. Or he disappeared of his own free will, afraid that I would file a complaint against him. Now my heart towards my son is indifferent." It was New Year's Eve morning. Poppy's house smelled like a holiday pine tar, fresh baked goods, tangerines. Grandma Vera was cooking skillfully in the kitchen. Mary was getting ready for school, admiring herself in the mirror. Today was the last school day before the long-awaited vacation. Baba Vera and Mary were now living with Poppy. It was working out naturally after all that had happened. Granny and her granddaughter had nowhere to go, and Poppy was having a hard time on her own. At the hospital, Poppy was examined and given appointments that made her noticeably better. She suspected that her recovery was not only due to the treatment, but also to the presence of people close to her. After all, to be needed by someone is happiness. Poppy regarded Vera as a friend and younger sister, and Mary as a granddaughter. They lived peacefully and amicably, each with their own difficult histories, but together they felt stronger. Poppy and Vera often discussed life, marveling at the strange way fate can change. Strangers become close and family become strangers.